Daenerys stood upon the prow of a battered ship in Blackwater Bay, her silver-gold hair matted from the sea spray, her eyes fixed on the distant skyline of King's Landing. The wind battered her cloak, and though summer still clung to the south, she felt an uncanny chill rippling through the air. It had been weeks since she first began hearing of the terrors befalling the north. Terrible stories of the living dead roaming the snows, of an ancient, otherworldly power that had shattered the wall at Eastwatch by the sea. Many had dismissed these rumors as ravings of frightened peasants, but the scattered survivors brought further testament to the unstoppable advance of the White Walkers. She had come to Westeros to claim the Iron Throne, but now, the war for the Dawn had overshadowed every ambition. A primal fear gnawed at the hearts of all who heard the stories. Even the small folk, who often worried more about bread and salt than news of faraway horrors, whispered in hushed voices about a nightmare army that marched under an endless winter sky. It was under these circumstances that Daenerys had landed on Dragonstone, forging a tenuous alliance with Jon Snow and the Lords of the North, who recognized the dire threat. But an unsettling series of events had led her here, waiting in the chill air, uncertain. Winter was not merely coming. It had arrived, and it carried the stench of doom on every gust of wind. Dragons roared in the distance, unsettled by forces they did not yet understand. In her heart, Daenerys Targaryen questioned if her destiny lay solely upon the Iron Throne, or if the realm's safety demanded that she cast aside her quest for dominion to preserve life itself. The days that followed her arrival were steeped in tension. Ravens came daily, each bearing graver tidings than the last. Reports spoke of the Night King's inexorable approach toward Winterfell, of entire villages in the north fallen silent. Refugees fled southward, only to find the Crownlands and the Stormlands rife with chaos and unprepared for the tide of the undead. Daenerys, ever mindful of her birthright, had struggled to balance the demands of war in the north against her desire to secure King's Landing. Yet with each passing dawn, it became clearer that no crown would matter if the White Walkers triumphed. Jon Snow had eventually convinced her to lead her dragons north. Together, they would attempt to destroy the Night King before he could overrun the Seven Kingdoms. Their uneasy alliance had been forged with Tyrion's counsel and Davos's pragmatism. So the Targaryen fleet set sail. The Unsullied marched by land through the war-torn riverlands, and the Dothraki rode in columns, uneasy in Westeros's colder climate but loyal to Daenerys's command. She had believed her greatest challenge would be uniting these proud warriors with the Lords of Winterfell, forging a single, unbreakable front. Little did she know fate had another path in store, a path that would lure her into the darkest corners of old magic and test her very soul. She had flown north on Drogon's back, leading Rhaegal and Viserion through the raging winds of winter. Snow fell heavily, and the freezing air stung her face. She watched the plains pass beneath them, blanketed in white. She knew fear for the first time in many years. The swirling snows of the north seemed endless, and a gnawing unease coiled in her stomach. Sometime during that arduous journey, she looked back at the smaller figures atop the second dragon. Jon rode Rhaegal, trying to steady himself, while the third dragon glided behind them. They were all heading into the heart of a nightmare, one that legend had long warned of but men had chosen to forget. In time, she and Jon reached Winterfell. The defenses were prepared as best they could be, the men and women from all over the north having rallied around the direwolf sigil. Yet the armies of House Stark were pitifully small compared to the monstrous host rumored to be approaching. Even with the Unsullied and the Dothraki, even with the knights and lords from the Vale who had come at Sansa's behest, the defenders felt dwarfed by the existential threat. Daenerys tried to summon confidence within herself. She was, after all, the mother of dragons, the breaker of chains. She was supposed to be the embodiment of defiance against tyranny. But the White Walkers were not tyrants in the usual sense. They were a force of death, an elemental darkness that recognized no treaties or entreaties, no pleas for mercy. They would not bend the knee. They would not negotiate. Winter would devour all in its path. Yet that was not entirely true, as Daenerys would discover. For the White Walkers had a hidden design. In centuries past, they had once been men, touched and twisted by the children of the forest's ancient magic. Their aims were inscrutable to mortals. Their king, the Night King, did not speak in a human tongue, nor did he show expressions of emotion. And still, there was a will behind his undead gaze. Whether it was hatred, vengeance, or a primordial instinct to extinguish all life, he pursued a singular goal. But in that swirling storm of death, Daenerys would find herself entangled in a fate neither she nor the living had anticipated. When the battle at Winterfell finally came, the living fought valiantly. The first wave of the undead crashed against the northern lines with unimaginable ferocity. The shrieking hordes, eyes glowing blue, poured across the snowy fields. The dragons soared overhead, spouting dragon fire that lit the night sky in a kaleidoscope of flame. At Daenerys' command, the Unsullied maintained disciplined ranks, their spears forming a bristling hedge against the relentless dead. The Dothraki, their aurochs gleaming, charged with savage cries. Atop Drogon, Daenerys unleashed torrents of fire that melted swathes of the undead. Yet no matter how many they felled, more kept coming, a ceaseless tide of once human flesh. Jon Snow, fighting at her side when possible, sought out the Night King, believing that if they could destroy him, the entire legion of the dead would fall. But the White Walkers controlled the cold itself, and ice storms raged wherever they moved, chilling the men and women of the living to the very bone. Daenerys circled the battlefield, unable to spot the Night King in the churning darkness. The snowstorm grew so thick that visibility dwindled to mere feet on the ground. Only through the bright orange glow of dragonfire did the defenders have any sense of orientation. Hours passed like moments in that desperate fight. The living were pushed back into the walls of Winterfell again and again. Corpses piled high near the gates, and Daenerys watched with horror as some of her bravest warriors fell, only to be raised anew in service of the enemy. The White Walkers themselves rarely engaged directly. They stood on the fringes of the carnage, pale and silent, waiting for the living to tire. Suddenly, the horns of Winterfell sounded a retreat. Shouting from the battlements told the defenders that the walls had been breached in several places. Tyrion, from a vantage point atop the ramparts, signaled to Daenerys with frantic waves. The castle was perilously close to being overrun. She guided Drogon lower, unleashing another stream of flame that incinerated a large chunk of the Whites pushing through a collapsed gate. Then, from the swirling snow, a barrage of ice spears soared up toward Drogon. Daenerys gasped, pulling on the massive creature's reins to veer aside. Drogon roared, narrowly avoiding the worst of it. One spear grazed his flank, leaving a trail of crimson across his scaled hide. Alarmed, Daenerys cursed under her breath. She scanned the darkness, and through the swirl of snow and the glow of flaming corpses, she saw him, the Night King himself, astride an undead Viserion. Her heart lurched. She had lost one dragon beyond the wall before the living had truly united. That terrible memory of Viserion's death still haunted her. The moment the Night King launched his icy javelin and brought down her beloved child, the loss had been immense, and now, to see Viserion's rotting wings illuminated by an unholy blue glow filled her with a fury she had never known. Fire and blood had always been the Targaryen words, and she called on that rage. She urged Drogon forward, letting the burning heat within the dragon rise into his throat. She would burn the Night King from the sky, reclaiming the memory of her fallen child by destroying the abomination that had enslaved him. Drogon let loose a blast of flames. The swirling inferno clashed with an eruption of ice from Viserion's maw. The two forces collided in midair, sending a shockwave through the storm. Daenerys held fast, teeth bared against the cold wind. The fight between Drogon and undead Viserion was savage, each beast roaring in defiance, biting and slashing as they soared above Winterfell's courtyard. On the ground, the living soldiers still battled for their lives, but many paused in awe and horror to watch the aerial duel. Dragonfire met icefire again and again. The night burned, crackled, and hissed. The resulting steam cloud obscured the sky in a shroud of black and white. Daenerys saw a chance. The Night King was focusing on trying to freeze Drogon's wings mid-beat, hoping to bring the living dragon down. She spurred Drogon to spin, outflanking Viserion's blasts. Drogon's tail lashed out, striking Viserion's side. The undead dragon screeched, exposing the Night King upon the saddle of swirling ice. Daenerys exhaled a furious battle cry and commanded Drogon to unleash a final blast of flame. It enveloped Viserion, searing away bits of dead flesh, yet the Night King remained untouched. She realized again that ordinary fire would not destroy him. She had once tried to incinerate a lone White Walker with dragonfire beyond the wall, but he had escaped. And with the Night King, the effect was even more muted. He seemed impervious, as though some ancient magic protected him from the flames she wielded. Suddenly, the Night King's hand shot forward. An icicle spear conjured from the air sword toward Drogon. Daenerys barely had time to gasp before the spear sliced through the membrane of Drogon's wing. The dragon spun in agony, his roar deafening. Daenerys clutched the spikes on Drogon's back, fighting to keep her seat as the beast spiraled downward. She tried to guide him away from Winterfell's courtyard, but the pain was too great, and they crashed into the yard below, sending men and wights flying in every direction. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs. She tumbled from Drogon's back, landing hard in a drift of snow and mud. Blood pounded in her ears. For a moment, she could hear nothing but the echoes of her own heartbeat. She tasted iron on her tongue. Forcing herself to sit up, she realized she had lost her sword. Drogon was writhing, pinned under his own weight with a gaping wound in his wing. She heard his guttural whimpers of pain. Furious tears stung her eyes. She stumbled forward, oblivious to the battle around her, ignoring the countless wights advancing. At that moment, she wanted nothing more than to protect her child, the last great hope against the darkness. A chilling presence swept over her. She looked up to see the Night King dismounting the undead Viserion a few yards away. His eyes glowed a luminous, icy blue. Wordlessly, he advanced. Daenerys felt an overwhelming dread. She had faced tyrants, faced dragons, had walked into a funeral pyre and emerged unscathed, but she had never felt the raw terror that emanated from this silent being. Every primal instinct in her body screamed to run, but pride and desperation kept her from fleeing. She raised her hands, as though by sheer force of will she might summon a flame to protect her. She was the unburnt, after all. Had she not survived the impossible? In one fluid motion, the Night King raised his arm. She expected a killing blow, an icy spear through her heart. Instead, he stopped. Time seemed to slow around them. Daenerys heard the clash of steel, the roar of dragons, and the screams of the living all fade into a dull roar in her mind. Their eyes locked, and in the Night King's inhuman gaze, she sensed curiosity, or perhaps recognition. It was as though he perceived something in her that gave him pause. Drogon roared again, struggling to lift himself, but the beast was too injured to rescue his mother. The Night King slowly extended his other hand, palm out, as if to touch her. Daenerys stood rooted to the spot. She did not understand what was happening, only that the frozen aura around him grew more intense. The very air seemed to crystallize. Frost spread across the ground, across her boots, up the folds of her torn cloak. She breathed in short, panicked gasps. Still, she could not tear her gaze from him. The Night King took one more step, and then his hand was upon her chest, over her pounding heart. She had expected pain, the freezing of her blood, instant death. But instead, she felt her senses slip away. A hollow numbness spread from the point of contact. Everything around her dimmed, as though she were drifting on the edge of consciousness. In that moment, her body ceased to be her own. She trembled uncontrollably. She tried to push him away, tried to scream, but no sound emerged. A frigid darkness enveloped her mind, and she felt an alien presence push into her thoughts. It was not a voice, nor any form of communication she had ever encountered, but a tide of cold power that forced itself deeper. She sensed a terrifying, ancient magic that had shaped the others, a magic older than the Targaryen line, older than the Undulls, older, perhaps, than the first men. Something inside her rebelled. She was Daenerys Stormborn, the mother of dragons, the breaker of chains. She had not knelt before Cersei Lannister, would not kneel before any king. She tried to recall her dragon's birth, the fires of the pyre that had given her life to new flame. She tried to conjure images of her love for her people, her compassion for the enslaved. She tried to remember the heat of her own fire, how she had walked across burning coals without harm. But the memory of warmth began to fade under the crushing cold. The memory of her dragons, her cause, the Iron Throne. They flickered as if a candle flame threatened by a gust of winter wind. And then, like a tendril of ice creeping through her veins, she felt the Night King's magic merge with something in her. A Targaryen's flame, subdued and perverted by freezing shadow. She collapsed to her knees, eyes wide, as a raw, excruciating sensation assaulted her senses. Yet her skin did not blacken, nor did her heart freeze to ice shards. She simply sank into a cold so profound that her spirit quailed. The last thought she had in those final moments of self was how devouring and unstoppable it felt. She believed, in one final flicker of consciousness, that she had died. But she had not. When Daenerys opened her eyes again, the battle was over. Or rather, it had shifted. The armies of the living had been decimated, and the whites were clearing the rubble of Winterfell, raising fresh corpses from the carnage. Faint tendrils of snow blew across the courtyard in which she lay. Above, the sky was still black with night. She looked around, disoriented, wondering why she felt no pain despite the bruises and cuts on her body. She had no memory of the last moments, save for that icy hand upon her chest. Now she found herself strangely unencumbered, as though she had awoken from a restful slumber rather than a brutal crash. The screams had dwindled to eerie moans, the last of the living being put to the sword or devoured by the dead. Her eyes settled on a cluster of whites methodically searching among the bodies. A line of newly risen undead stood in ragged formation nearby. She shuddered, her breath catching. Any moment, they would realize she was alive and tear her limb from limb. She tried to move, but realized her limbs responded sluggishly, as if the cold had claimed them. Panic fluttered in her chest. She stared at her hands and saw frost crusting along her fingers, as though her very warmth were leached away. A single white turned its head in her direction. She tensed, preparing to defend herself. But instead of charging or roaring, the white merely regarded her with lifeless eyes, then turned back to its grisly work. She was stunned. They were ignoring her. For a moment, she thought she might have perished and become one of them. Yet she felt her heart still beating, slow and steady, though it was strangely subdued, as if each beat was cushioned by layers of frost. And she could breathe, albeit each breath was a cool wisp of air that neither warmed nor comforted her. Her body ached, but she was very much alive. She staggered to her feet, uncertain and trembling. The Night King was nowhere to be seen. Drogon was gone from the courtyard, and she dreaded to think what might have happened to her beloved dragon. The last thing she recalled was his agonized roar. Had he flown away despite the wound, or had the White Walkers slain him? Before she could process her dismay, she heard a grinding sound behind her. Turning slowly, she saw 3 White Walkers emerging from a haze of drifting snow. Their tall, gaunt figures were clad in thin, ragged armor of icy coloration. Their spears glittered with frost. They moved with an almost regal poise, and all 3 paused a few yards from her, eyes glowing with that same piercing blue. Daenerys tried to reach for a weapon, any weapon, but she had none. She wanted to flee, but some part of her told her it would be pointless. She expected them to kill her where she stood. Instead, they inclined their heads with a subtle stiffness, almost like a bow. Her confusion deepened. In that prolonged silence, Daenerys felt something stir inside her chest. It was like a cold brand, a link between her consciousness and something vast, something that spanned the icy wilderness beyond Winterfell. She felt drawn north, as though her spirit were tethered to the heart of winter itself. The White Walkers tilted their heads in near unison, as if beckoning her to follow. And though she possessed enough will to sense the strangeness of this moment, her limbs moved before her mind could protest. She took one step forward, and then another, as though an unseen hand guided her. The 3 White Walkers turned and led her beyond the battered gates of Winterfell, through corridors littered with the dead. Whites parted to let her pass, paying her no more mind than they would pay one of their own. She was brought to the Godswood. The ancient weirwood stood silent, its white bark stained red with the carved face of a nameless deity. Snow clung to its branches, and the reflection in the still water of the pool beneath its boughs was that of a realm shrouded in the hush of fresh aftermath. And there, by the pool, stood the Night King. His silhouette was stark against the whiteness of the tree. The presence within Daenerys's chest pulsed at the sight of him, sending waves of frigid energy coursing through her body. She hesitated, anxiety warring with a strange compulsion that urged her forward. The Night King turned to face her. He lifted his hand once more, and she half expected him to plunge them both into an even darker magic. Instead, he merely observed her. Now, in the moonlight that shone through the branches of the weirwood, she saw more detail in his inhuman features. A face seemingly carved from ice, sharp ridges crowning his skull, eyes the color of frozen seas. He stood motionless, perhaps waiting for her to speak. She tried, but her voice came out in a rasp. "What have you done to me?" she whispered, though his lips did not move. She felt a rippling sensation in the air, as though the power within him responded in some intangible way. A wordless answer brushed against her mind, at once distant and intimate. It conveyed an impression of acceptance, of usage, and of purpose, as though he had found in her a vessel for something larger. Her Targaryen blood, suffused with ancient Valyrian magic and the fire of dragons, had not perished when he touched her. It had fused with his own dark enchantment, creating a living conduit between them. She was not merely a White or a White Walker. She was something else, still Daenerys Targaryen, yet inextricably bound to the powers of ice. Trembling, she realized he was not going to kill her. He had claimed her in a sense that transcended mortality. She felt the cold magic in her veins, and it responded to her like an unspoken command. She recalled how she had commanded dragons, forging a bond that few in history could replicate. Now that bond was distorted, replaced, or perhaps expanded by an unholy counterpart. She felt as if she could sense the entire army of the dead lurking in the courtyard and beyond, a great web of cold consciousness that connected each White to the White Walker's will. Silent terror rose in her. She tried to muster defiance, to scream at him, to lash out with some final, desperate act. But then she felt an undeniable pulse of power in her chest, a silent demand that she could not refuse. She involuntarily raised her hands, and, to her shock, the ground around her began to freeze, ice crystals blossoming across the snow and creeping up the trunk of the weirwood. She dropped her hands in horror, stepping back. The White Walkers around her did not stir, and the Night King remained as still as death. His glacial gaze never left her. Some time passed in an eerie hush. The Godswood's rustling branches and the low groans of the dead were the only sounds. Daenerys felt her mind teetering on the brink of madness, searching for a reason in the midst of this nightmare. She remembered, distantly, the visions she had seen in the House of the Undying. Visions of a frozen throne room, the roof torn open, snow falling on the Iron Throne. At the time, she had believed it a sign of the winter to come, or a warning of the White Walker's approach. Now, she wondered if it had been a prophecy of something far more personal, that her destiny and winter's arrival would entwine. She remembered Tyrion, Grey Worm, Missandei, all the loyal souls who had followed her across the sea, believing in her. She thought of Jon Snow, who had pleaded with her to help the North, who had believed in her goodness. Where were they now? Had they fallen in the battle? Were they still alive somewhere, maybe in retreat or scattered in the aftermath? She felt a pang of sorrow, fleeting but real. It reminded her she was still human in some part of her soul, though the ice that clutched her heart threatened to strangle that flicker of emotion. All the while, the Night King watched. Eventually, he turned away from the weirwood and gestured with a slow, deliberate movement of his arm. From the shadows, a White trudged forward, dragging a limp form. Daenerys's heart lurched at what she saw next. It was a man in black leathers, his thick cloak bearing the stark sigil. It was Jon Snow. He was unconscious, or nearly so, his face pale from loss of blood. A gash across his abdomen stained his clothes a dark crimson. She opened her mouth in a silent cry, stepping forward despite herself, but 2 white walkers intercepted her with spears angled, halting her advance. The white dropped Jon into the snow near the Night King's feet. Jon stirred feebly, eyes fluttering open, breath rasping. He seemed delirious, perhaps only half aware of his surroundings. Daenerys wanted to run to him, to cradle his head and whisper words of comfort. Anything but to watch him die helplessly in the jaws of this horror. But she could not move without the threat of those spears. Her gaze darted to the Night King, who stared down at Jon with an expressionless face. An icy tension thickened the air. Jon coughed, weakly raising his head. He blinked, trying to focus on the shape looming above him. A spark of recognition passed through his eyes, and he attempted to roll away, but he was too weak. The Night King bent down, gripping Jon by the front of his cloak. Daenerys shuddered. She knew too well what was about to happen. The Night King would claim another prisoner or kill Jon outright. The White Walkers behind him seemed to tense, anticipating their lord's next move. At that moment, Daenerys found her voice, her mind burning with desperation. "Stop!" she screamed, surprising herself with the force of her cry, cut through the cold air like a dagger. The Night King turned to regard her. She couldn't explain why, but she felt his attention shift, as though her plea carried weight now that she was bound to him in some arcane way. She took a trembling breath. Her next words were meant for Jon as much as for the inhuman creature before her. "Please, do not kill him." Jon's eyes flicked to her, confusion etched on his face as he truly saw her for the first time. She realized how she must look. Frost upon her skin, a vacant cast to her features, standing among the White Walkers as though she belonged. She saw horror twist his expression. He tried to rise, grimacing in pain. She wanted to tell him she was still herself, that she was trapped in this curse, but the words would not come. Her gaze returned to the Night King, who studied her impassively. She felt that presence in her chest pulse again, cold magic swirling in her veins. She sensed that he was testing her, seeing how she would wield the sliver of power he had given her. Daenerys swallowed hard. Her mind raced. She could not break free with mere defiance. The White Walkers would slaughter Jon in an instant. She had to do something. But what? In that moment, a terrible realization dawned on her. If she wanted to spare Jon's life, she might have to obey the Night King's unspoken commands. She might have to prove her fealty. Her entire being recoiled at the thought. Had she not spent her life destroying chains? And now, was she about to place her neck under the cold yoke of an undead king? Yet, as she hesitated, she sensed that she had no choice if she wished to preserve Jon, or any last shred of hope. Her voice quivered when she finally spoke, turning to address the Night King directly. "I will serve," she whispered, each word tasting like ashes. "Spare him, and I will serve." She loathed the sound of that promise. It was an oath of surrender, the very antithesis of everything she had fought for. But in her chest, the cold magic swirled approvingly, as though she had spoken the correct incantation. The Night King considered her for a moment that felt like an eternity. Then, in a single motion, he released Jon, who collapsed into the snow, gasping. Daenerys felt both relief and dread. She had saved Jon this time, but she had bound herself to an unholy bargain. The Night King gestured again, and the white that had dragged Jon forward grabbed him once more, pulling him away into the darkness of the courtyard beyond the Godswood. Daenerys tried to follow, but the White Walkers kept their weapons raised. She did not know what would become of Jon now, whether he would remain a prisoner or be left to die from his wounds. The promise she had made might have only spared him a few more moments of life. She searched the Night King's eyes for clarity, but he gave none. In the days that followed, Daenerys became a prisoner of winter, in more ways than one. The Night King led his armies from the ravaged ruins of Winterfell southward, bringing an eternal storm with them. Wherever they marched, the land froze, rivers hardened into ice, and the dead walked in their wake. Daenerys walked at the head of this legion, flanked by White Walkers, every step a betrayal of the living. She had no way to gauge how many survivors had escaped the battle, but from the vantage point of memory, she knew few would have survived to warn the rest of Westeros. And as they moved, any living soul they encountered was either slaughtered or added to the ranks of the dead. It was a nightmare parade, and Daenerys was its unwilling herald. At night, she was plagued by visions, dreams of fire and ice clashing in endless storms. She awoke each time feeling the cold anchor in her chest tighten, as though the Night King's power tethered her closer to him. The White Walkers did not speak, and neither did the Whites. She was left alone with the horror of each day's march. Yet she noticed a curious detail. Though the living around her fell to the merciless blades of the undead, she never saw Jon among their victims. Part of her dared to hope he was still alive, though that hope was a fragile flame in a sea of ice. Occasionally, the Night King would beckon her forward, silently commanding her to demonstrate her new power. With trembling dread, she discovered that she indeed possessed an echo of his icy capabilities. She could freeze the ground beneath her feet, create spears of ice with a flick of her wrist, and in time, she even learned to raise wights from fresh corpses. The first time he forced her to do so, revulsion overwhelmed her. She cried out, tears freezing on her cheeks, as she compelled the corpse of a fallen villager to stand once more, eyes blazing blue with the cold flame of undeath. She retched afterward, sickened by what she had done. Yet the Night King only observed her with silent equanimity, as though satisfied she was fulfilling her role. She hated him with a passion that burned in the darkest corner of her heart. But she could not deny the power that now coursed through her. She had only begun to scratch the surface of it. She suspected that the Night King intended to mold her into some twisted consort of winter, a living host for his ancient magic that might grant him greater dominion over the realm. Had he not, in ages past, taken a bride in the legends told by Old Nan? The story of the Night's King and his corpse queen now came to mind. Was she to be a new queen of ice, enthralled to his will? And yet, she remained herself in many ways. She could think, could remember, could question. This perplexed her. Why had he left her mind intact? Was it because of her dragons, her Targaryen blood, or some deeper reason? Each day, she wrestled with these questions, each day feeling a creeping acceptance that terrified her more than her predicament itself. She knew she must resist, if only to keep alive the memory of who she had been and what she had stood for. Meanwhile, the undead horde swept across the north, leaving it a land of silent towns and haunted forests. At the edges of her awareness, Daenerys could sense the dragons. Drogon was still alive, though wounded. She felt a faint tether of warmth each time her thoughts drifted to him, a golden thread overshadowed by the cold. She realized that if Drogon still lived, Rhaegal might too. And if that was the case, perhaps the living had not lost all hope. She clung to this knowledge, letting it spark something like resistance in her chest. Weeks passed in this silent conquest. The White Walkers steered the enormous mass of the dead inexorably south. The living, taken by surprise, found themselves overwhelmed in each holdfast or castle they tried to defend. From the Dreadfort to Torrens Square, from White Harbor to Moat Cailin, each fortress was eventually toppled. The night sky seemed perpetually choked by storm clouds, making the days gloomier, each dawn hardly distinct from dusk. And Daenerys walked among this endless twilight, feeling torn between her horror at the atrocities committed and the relentless pull of the Night King's magic. Then came a turning point. As the undead army approached the neck, a narrow pass that divided the north from the southern kingdoms, the White Walkers encountered unexpected resistance. A regrouped host of living soldiers, led by none other than Grey Worm, formed a defensive line at Moat Cailin. Tywin Lannister once called Moat Cailin the key to the north, an ancient fortress now mostly ruined, but with enough causeways and towers to deter any large army. Despite the unstoppable nature of the undead, the terrain and the fortress's vantage offered a temporary choke point. Daenerys glimpsed the unsullied banners snapping in the wind, the silver dragon of House Targaryen sewn beneath them, signifying their continued loyalty to her rightful cause. Her heart clenched at the sight. Grey Worm must have survived the massacre at Winterfell, rallying survivors. Perhaps Tyrion was with him or Missandei. She could not see them from afar, but in her chest, she felt a fluttering sense of recognition, a longing to cry out to them that she still lived, that she was here. But her soul froze when she heard the Night King's silent order. She sensed his will pressing upon her, a cold directive to use her powers, to annihilate the last stronghold of living defenders in the north. She felt her limbs move as though commanded by strings. She advanced, flanked by tall white walkers. Grey Worm was visible upon the ramparts, scanning the horizon anxiously. She almost broke down when she realized he was looking for her, Daenerys, his queen, hoping for rescue or a coordinated strategy. He could not know that she was now the unwilling hand of the undead host. Suddenly, war horns sounded. The ranks of the dead surged forward. The moats and wetlands surrounding Moat Cailin made direct assault difficult. Grey Worm and his forces rained arrows down, striking the first wave of whites. For a moment, it seemed the living might hold. But Daenerys felt the Night King's eyes on her. He stood atop a small rise of earth, an imposing figure. Beside him perched Viserion, skeletal wings tattered but still functional, a faint glow of icy breath leaking from the dragon's maw. Daenerys approached the broken causeway, the water below half frozen by the bitter wind. She felt the presence in her chest swirl, urging her to unleash the cold. With trembling reluctance, she stretched out her hands. She saw Grey Worm's eyes widen on the battlements as he recognized her. He shouted her name, raising his spear in shock. She opened her mouth to cry a warning, but only a ragged breath came out. The magic overtook her. Frost leapt from her palms, racing across the wetlands with unnatural speed. The shallow waters froze solid, providing a perfect path for the whites to march upon. Then came more, jagged spikes of ice erupting from the ground beneath Moat Cailin's outer defenses, impaling many defenders. Grey Worm dove aside, narrowly avoiding the same fate. Screams echoed across the fortress as men fell from the walls, limbs severed by spears of ice. The Unsullied, disciplined as ever, tried to hold formation, but they were unprepared for this supernatural onslaught. Daenerys felt every death like a black arrow to her conscience. Her own people were dying under her hand. She wept, tears freezing before they fell. Grey Worm locked eyes with her across the battlefield. She read betrayal, confusion, heartbreak in his gaze. Then, he vanished behind a curtain of whites that swarmed the collapsed sections of the wall. The battle was swift. The living defenders fought bravely, but the undead had no need for rest or mercy. Soon, the last garrison was overrun. Daenerys stumbled across the blood-slick stones, searching desperately through the carnage for some sign of Grey Worm, or Tyrion, or Missandei. She found only scattered corpses, and one by one, the whites began raising them. The short silhouette of a man with a braided beard caught her eye. Her heart skipped, but as she approached, she realized it was just another fallen soldier. Tyrion was not among the bodies that she could see, nor was Missandei. She dared to hope they had escaped. She did, however, find Grey Worm. He was crumpled against the shattered remains of a tower, mortally wounded. His chest heaved with shallow breaths. She fell to her knees beside him, ignoring the presence of whites, who hovered but did not interfere with her. Grey Worm looked up at her, eyes glassy with pain. In a small voice, he spoke her name. "Your Grace," he coughed, blood staining his lips. Daenerys reached out, wanting to hold him, to comfort him, but she recoiled when she saw frost creeping along her own skin. She feared she would do more harm than good. Tears streamed down her cheeks, turning to tiny crystals. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice choked. "I never wanted this." Grey Worm struggled to speak, confusion and hurt mingling in his gaze. He had been prepared to die for her cause. He had not been prepared to see her like this, commanding the forces that slew his comrades. Still, a glimmer of loyalty remained in him. His lips trembled, as though trying to form the words, but none came. Daenerys was about to plead for his forgiveness when he closed his eyes and exhaled a final, ragged breath. She let out a shaky sob, gently touching his shoulder. Even in death, Grey Worm's face held a trace of loyalty, heartbreak, and a question that would never be answered. She sat there for a time, the stillness of the aftermath pressing upon her. The White Walkers milled about, gathering fresh corpses to be raised. The Night King appeared again, gliding silently across the frozen ground. He cast his gaze upon Grey Worm's body, then turned his attention to Daenerys, as if expecting her to stand aside so he could raise the skilled warrior into the ranks of the dead. A surge of revulsion ripped through her, spurring her to an act of defiance. She rose and blocked the Night King's path, arms spread protectively over Grey Worm's fallen form. "No," she rasped, her voice quivering with rage. "Not him. I will not allow it." The Night King tilted his head, cold eyes unblinking. Daenerys waited, her body taut, expecting him to punish her, to force her aside. Instead, he simply turned away, continuing his silent inventory of the battlefield. The Whites did not approach Grey Worm's body again. Daenerys was left to wonder if this was a cruelty, allowing her some small victory while ensuring she remained in chains, or if there was a faint sense of acknowledgement in the Night King's inhuman mind that she required these small mercies to remain pliant. With Moat Cailin fallen, the path south lay open. The undead host, bolstered by fresh whites, streamed through the neck, entering the riverlands. And as they marched, the cold marched with them, turning once fertile fields into frostbitten expanses, freezing rivers and lakes, blanketing villages and towns in snow far heavier than any ordinary winter. The siege of Harrenhal, the crossing at the Twins, each fell in turn. Rumors preceded their arrival, carried by terrified refugees who fled in droves. But many had nowhere to go. King's Landing lay far to the south, and the lords who might have once opposed each other in the Game of Thrones found themselves ill-prepared to unite in the face of this unstoppable onslaught. Daenerys marched on, her steps guided by an unholy compulsion. She witnessed small clusters of living defenders attempt guerrilla tactics against the dead, only to be overwhelmed. She saw pillars of smoke from the ruins of villages, and she heard the lamentations of those few survivors who cowered behind locked doors, praying for a miracle. In a cruel twist, the only miracle she could offer was a quick death rather than the torment of being raised as whites. Sometimes, she found herself freezing an entire group of the living when they launched a desperate attack. She tried to spare them, but the Night Kings will pushed through her, forcing her to unleash the killing frost. Each time, her soul felt a little more battered, as though the warmth of empathy faded inch by inch. Though she could not be certain, she sensed that with each step south, the Night King drew power from her Targaryen blood, melding fire and ice in a new form of sorcery. She found herself longing to see one of her dragons, hoping Drogon might save her from this enslavement. But she had neither seen nor felt his presence in many days. Her dreams of him were fleeting, overshadowed by nightmares of the undead. Yet she still felt that tiny thread of warmth whenever her thoughts turned to him, like a distant star in a sky of endless night. Eventually, their path led them toward the Trident, the great river that had seen the fall of Rhaegar Targaryen generations ago, an event that spelled doom for House Targaryen. Now another Targaryen, Daenerys, marched with a legion of the dead across those same banks. It was here that a new alliance of living forces attempted to make a stand. Houses from the Vale, the Stormlands, and even from Dorne had banded together with the few Lannisters still loyal to the crown, all hoping to halt the advance of the dead before they reached King's Landing. Daenerys, standing atop a low ridge with the Night King beside her, gazed upon the living army's banners. She saw stags of Baratheon, sunspears of Martell, mockingbirds of Baelish's Vale lords, and lions of Lannister. She felt a pang when she noticed no sign of her own three-headed dragon banner. Perhaps Tyrion had taken it with him, or perhaps it was lost in the wreckage of Winterfell. A hush preceded the coming battle. The living host stood on one side of the wide river, fortifications hastily erected. The dead assembled on the other side, an endless mass that stretched into the snowy distance. Even in daylight, the sky was a dreary gray, the sun a pale circle behind thick clouds. A single horn blew from the living side, signaling readiness. On the undead side, only silence. Then, the Night King held out his hand, and Daenerys felt the chill in her chest surge. She raised her arms as though in a trance. The river at her feet began to crack, ice forming across its surface. The living archers loosed a volley of flaming arrows, but the whites marched undaunted, crossing the freezing water. Another wave of arrows ignited the front ranks of the undead, but more pressed forward, trampling the burning corpses. Siege weapons hurled stones at the whites, smashing them to pieces, but they rose again, reassembled by the Night King's power. The living cavalry, wearing thick steel and armed with dragonglass-tipped lances, charged from the flanks, cutting through whites as they tried to scatter the swarm. For a moment, it seemed that discipline, strategy, and superior weaponry might hold. But the White Walkers entered the fray, each strike of their ice weapons shattering steel. Where they led, the dead followed, unstoppable. Daenerys watched this from a vantage point, forced to direct blasts of cold wherever the living's defense seemed strongest, systematically dismantling their lines. She could sense the heartbreak of those men and women. She saw fear shining in their eyes as they realized a queen of fire and dragons had become an agent of the ancient enemy. Her heart ached, a ghost of the fiery passion she once carried, but a thicker layer of ice smothered that flame with each passing moment. As the living ranks began to falter, a sudden roar tore through the sky. Daenerys's heart leapt. She would know that roar anywhere. Drogon swooped in from the east, his enormous black wings beating the air. Rhaegal soared with him, though he bore scars from some earlier wound. They unleashed a torrent of dragonfire upon the undead lines, incinerating scores of whites. The living ranks rallied with renewed hope at the sight of dragons. The roars of the living dragons clashed with the keening shrieks of Viserion, who rose to meet them. An aerial battle commenced. Daenerys trembled, gazing up at Drogon circling overhead. She felt a faint echo of their bond stirring in her chest, conflicting with the Night King's magic. The dragons soared lower, black scales gleaming even in the muted light, searching for his mother. She took a step forward involuntarily, longing to call out. But the White Walkers around her raised their weapons, sensing the danger. Above, Viserion spewed deadly ice at Drogon, who narrowly dodged, swiping a massive claw across the undead dragon's bony flank. The battle on the ground reached a fever pitch. The living, emboldened by the appearance of dragons, surged forward. Daenerys saw glimpses of knights bearing Baratheon sigils charging valiantly, only to be crushed by hordes of whites. The Night King watched the aerial conflict with cold calculation. Finally, he turned to Daenerys, his silent command piercing her mind. She felt his power amplify within her. He wanted her to bring down Drogon and Rhaegal with the same ice lances that had once slain Viserion. "No," she begged, voice cracking. "They are my children. I will not." He stared at her, an implacable mask of winter. She felt an unyielding pressure in her mind, an invisible vice tightening around her will. Frost formed on her skin. Her breath hitched, body shaking. She was losing control. Her arms lifted as though another force moved them. She looked up in horror, tears brimming. Drogon and Rhaegal circled overhead, oblivious to the mortal threat from below. Before she could unleash the fatal blasts of ice, a racking jolt of warmth surged into her. She gasped, felt as if someone poured hot coals into her veins. She stumbled, confusion racking her. For a moment, the Night King's influence broke, and she felt only the surging warmth of love for her dragons. Blinking through tears, she managed to direct her hands away from Drogon and Rhaegal, hurling a spray of ice harmlessly into the air, far from them. The Night King's eyes snapped toward her, accusing and terrible. In that instant, Daenerys saw the source of the warmth. Jon Snow stood amid the battlefield, sword in hand, a determined fire lighting his gaze. He had come, despite his grievous wounds, or perhaps they had been tended. Flanked by a small cadre of northern warriors who had somehow survived, he advanced through the chaos. Daenerys felt the bond between them flare, that last vestige of her humanity bridging the gap that the Night King's magic had created. She tried to speak, tried to warn him of the danger. The White Walkers spotted Jon and moved to intercept, but he charged with the ferocity of a man who had already died once and refused to die again. He swung Longclaw, the Valyrian steel blade singing in the frosty air. The first White Walker to meet him was cut in half, its body shattering into crystalline shards. Another approached from behind, but Jon, as if guided by some sixth sense, spun and sliced it across the chest, disintegrating it in a flash of ice crystals. Daenerys felt the Night King's fury raging in her mind like a black storm. She tried to resist his will, but it pressed upon her more forcefully now, commanding her to kill Jon Snow, to destroy the one who threatened their reign of winter. She fought against that impulse with every fiber of her being. Jon's eyes found hers across the distance. He saw the conflict contorting her features. He pressed forward, cutting through a line of whites that sought to block him. The Night King moved, the swirl of snow around him intensifying, his footsteps leaving a trail of frost. He raised a jagged spear of ice, aiming for Jon's heart. Daenerys choked back a scream. She must do something. She could not let Jon die. But the power in her chest, once under the Night King's thrall, held her in place. She could feel it magnetized to his presence. Her limbs shook with the effort of resisting. At the last second, Drogon dove, unleashing a column of flame between Jon and the Night King. The undead commander recoiled, stepping back just enough for Jon to evade the lethal throw. The ground around them melted, and steam erupted in clouds. Daenerys used the distraction, channeling her own will into the cold magic. She found that if she exerted enough force of her own, she could choose its target. Instead of hurling ice at Jon or Drogon, she directed it at the White Walkers near her. Spines of frost erupted from the ground, impaling them where they stood. They shattered, their unnatural existence undone in an explosion of icy shards. The Night King turned on her, eyes blazing with a terrible light. Daenerys met his gaze with newfound defiance. She was Daenerys Targaryen, mother of dragons, and though she had been touched by darkness, the flame of her spirit still flickered. She felt the tension in her chest intensify, the cold link between them threatening to tear her apart. But she refused to yield. She poured her fury into the ice magic, fracturing that link ever so slightly, enough to reassert her free will in the moment. With a roar that was part agony, part triumph, Daenerys seized control of the swirling magic. Ice coalesced into a spear in her hand. The Night King saw what she intended. He raised his own weapon, but she was faster, driven by a final surge of desperate courage. She hurled the spear of ice, not at Jon, not at her dragons, but at the Night King's chest. The projectile streaked through the air, lodging with a resounding crack. A horrifying moment of silence followed. The Night King looked down at the spear jutting from his breastplate of ice, as though perplexed. Then cracks spread across his torso, spiderwebbing outward from the point of impact. The White Walker's face contorted, and a sound like shattering glass filled the air. In an instant, the Night King's form exploded into thousands of icy shards, glimmering in the half-light as they fell to the ground. Daenerys felt the anchor in her chest wrench violently, and she collapsed to her knees, letting out a ragged scream. The whites around them stumbled, momentarily disoriented, as if the central mind controlling them had been abruptly severed. Some collapsed altogether, while others wandered aimlessly. Jon raced forward, ignoring the whites that still twitched. He reached Daenerys, kneeling at her side. She looked up at him, tears in her eyes, half expecting him to recoil from her. But he gathered her trembling form in his arms, ignoring the frost that still clung to her skin. She felt his warmth and sobbed, the ice inside her chest cracking. The swirl of darkness that had controlled her began to subside, replaced by the fierce pounding of her heart. Though she still bore the taint of the Night King's magic, it no longer bound her will. All around them, the living forces pressed the advantage. Drogon and Rhaegal rained fire on the disoriented whites. One by one, the White Walkers still standing were slain by dragonglass spears or Valyrian steel blades. Their hold over the undead army crumbled. Like marionettes with severed strings, countless whites collapsed. Others wandered aimlessly, easy targets for the living to finish off. The living host erupted in triumphant cries as the White Walkers were wiped out. Ice shattered underfoot, and the creeping winter that had blanketed the land began to retreat, the magical storm dissipating. Daenerys gazed at the spot where the Night King had stood, now just fragments of ice littering the muddy ground. The army of the dead was broken, but at an unfathomable cost. The north lay in ruin, tens of thousands of lives had been lost, and she herself had become a twisted conduit for the White Walker's magic. She pressed a trembling hand to her chest, feeling the faint echo of that winter power still lingering. She feared what it might mean for her future, whether she would be able to rid herself of this curse entirely. Jon held her, cradling her face. For a moment, she felt only relief, only the precious knowledge that they had survived. She thought of Grey Worm who had not. She thought of the countless souls who had fallen in battle after battle. She also thought of the vow she had made to the Night King, to serve if Jon was spared. The White Walkers were gone now, and yet a part of her worried about the consequences of that broken vow, as though the land itself might remember. In the aftermath, the living began their slow process of picking up the pieces. Tyrion, Missandei, and a handful of others emerged from hiding, having orchestrated last-minute alliances. They came to Daenerys, wariness and empathy in their eyes. Many recognized the changes in her. Her skin seemed paler, her touch unnaturally cold. She confessed the horrors she had endured, voice trembling with guilt. Though some among the living looked upon her with fear, many more remembered her past deeds, the liberation of slaves, the forging of alliances. They saw she had risked her very soul to destroy the Night King from within. As the days stretched on, Daenerys worked tirelessly to help the survivors rebuild. She commanded her dragons to carry supplies and ferry messages across the ravaged realm. The bite of winter magic in her blood did not fade completely, but she harnessed what remained to restore rather than destroy, freezing broken walls so they could be temporarily supported, sealing shattered bridges until new structures could be built. She walked among the battered populace, offering what solace she could, though she knew some might never trust her fully again. Jon stayed at her side, helping her shoulder the burden of leadership. Together, they oversaw the reestablishment of order. The great houses, decimated by the war, sought new means of governance. Daenerys remained uneasy about her claim to the Iron Throne, knowing that her ordeal had changed her irrevocably. The question of rulership loomed, but for now, survival and recovery took precedence. The living had earned a respite, fragile though it was. Over time, the world took note that Daenerys Targaryen, once the unburnt, now bore the scars of ice. She still commanded dragons, but she no longer craved the throne as she once did. She had seen a darkness too vast, nearly succumbed to it, and emerged only by the grace of her own spirit and the help of those who loved her. Though the White Walkers had been vanquished, their memory lingered in her veins. Sometimes, late at night, she dreamed of that frozen godswood, of the Night King's silent gaze, and she would wake with a gasp, half expecting the swirl of snow to envelop her again. And yet she held on. She dedicated herself to ensuring that the realm's future would never again be threatened by such a nightmare. She forged alliances, rebuilt old bridges between warring houses, and did her best to bring unity to a land that had tasted the brink of extinction. In this, her strange new powers proved useful. She demonstrated that she could protect as well as destroy. Some murmured that she had become a symbol of balance between fire and ice, bridging the old rival magics that had once torn the world asunder. In the quiet that followed, people spoke in hushed legends of the time Daenerys Targaryen had served the White Walkers and lived to tell the tale. They whispered how she had walked the line between life and death, how she had sacrificed her freedom and nearly her soul to spare the man she loved, how she had ultimately turned the Night King's magic against him. Some feared her still, calling her the Ice Queen behind her back. Others revered her, believing her an avatar of a new dawn, a living testament to the possibility of peace after cataclysm. For Daenerys, the truth was simpler. She had been broken, enslaved, and forced to commit atrocities. She had lost dear friends and loyal followers along the way. She had stood on the edge of an abyss that threatened to consume her. And in the end, the flicker of warmth in her heart, an ember of hope, love, and determination, had prevailed. She carried the guilt of her actions and the gratitude for her salvation in equal measure. Thus began a new era in Westeros. The snows receded slowly, and the realm bore deep wounds from the Great War. Jon Snow labored by her side, bridging House Stark and House Targaryen in a union that many hoped would usher in lasting harmony. Tyrion advised them both, his keen mind tempered by the horrors he, too, had witnessed. Missandei comforted Daenerys in her darkest hours, reminding her that she was still the breaker of chains, even if she had worn them herself for a time. And though nightmares of ice and death would forever haunt her, Daenerys Targaryen rose each day with renewed purpose. She walked a path few could understand, a path neither entirely of fire nor entirely of ice, but somewhere in between, shaped by sorrow and redemption. And in that quiet space between extremes, she found the strength to guide the world toward a future free of the endless night that once threatened to claim them all. In the years that followed, when chroniclers wrote of the Great War and the near destruction of humanity at the hands of the White Walkers, they struggled to capture the full depth of what transpired. Stories diverged in their interpretations of Daenerys' role. Some portrayed her as a tragic figure, a queen coerced by ancient magic. Others labeled her a dark savior who embraced forbidden powers to save the world. And still others romanticized her as a cursed heroine who endured servitude to an unearthly king, only to strike him down with the very weapon he had forced upon her. Whatever the historians decided, none could deny that she stood at the center of that final confrontation, forging a new destiny in the icy crucible of an endless winter. And though she would forever bear the memory of the cold in her veins, the fire of her spirit burned on, lighting a path for those who followed, reminding them that even when darkness seems all-consuming, a single spark of defiance can break the longest night. Daenerys Targaryen stood at the edge of a scorched field in the Riverlands, watching a ragged line of survivors distribute what little bread remained to the men, women, and children who had lost their homes in the Great War. The wind carried the sharp scent of ash and the faint tang of blood, an aroma all too familiar after months of unending battle. Though the threat of the White Walkers had passed with the death of the Night King, ruin lay across the land like a threadbare shroud. Villages were flattened, towns emptied, families torn apart. As she gazed upon the hollow faces in the crowd, she fought back a wave of remorse and guilt. Her own reflection flickered in the puddles at her feet. Long gone was the queen who had once stepped from a funeral pyre unburnt. The war had changed her both within and without. Her hair, now streaked with white from frost as much as from Targaryen silver, hung in tangled braids. Her cheeks were gaunt, her eyes haunted. A chill still radiated from her skin, a vestige of the Night King's magic that lingered in her blood. Time and again, she had tried to rid herself of that icy residue. Priests of the Red God, healers from Essos, even wise women from Dorne had examined her, hoping to release her from the curse. Yet the cold remained, a reminder that she had once served the darkness she had vowed to destroy. Across the field, Jon Snow conferred quietly with a group of guards. His face, equally drawn and worn, lit up with something like determination as he gave instructions. Daenerys caught snatches of the conversation. The men were to ride north to discover if there were any pockets of whites left behind after the fall of the Night King. While most of the undead army had collapsed at the moment of his destruction, rumors persisted of scattered bands that still roamed aimless. Sly, killing without direction or purpose. Such threats had to be tracked down and eliminated before they could endanger more lives. Jon's voice carried a new authority these days. The people followed him with a trust he had earned through repeated self-sacrifice. Yet even as they trusted him, they threw uneasy glances toward Daenerys, uncertain where to place this queen who had, for a time, wielded the White Walker's powers. She turned her gaze away, focusing on the scorched countryside. It was no small irony that where her dragons had once been hailed as symbols of liberation, they now brought mixed emotions. People cheered whenever Drogon or Regal soared overhead, for the dragons had proven essential in the final victory. But many also remembered that one of those dragons, Viserion, had been twisted into an undead monstrosity. They recalled how Daenerys herself had marshaled terrible ice magic against them, even if she had been under the Night King's thrall. She felt the weight of those memories in every wary glance. She looked over her shoulder and saw Missandei approaching with slow, careful steps. The woman who had once been her closest confidant and interpreter still dressed in the fashion of Essos, though she wore a thick cloak to ward off the winter chill that lingered even as the seasons slowly turned. Her gentle eyes carried both sympathy and concern. "Your Grace," Missandei said quietly, inclining her head with that same grace she had always shown. "The stewards have distributed most of the supplies we brought from King's Landing. There isn't enough for everyone. Some will go hungry." Daenerys nodded, expression grim. "We must do what we can. See if we can spare more from the shipments coming up the Blackwater Rush. That will mean less for the Crownlands," Missandei noted, though her tone was not accusatory. "Those lands also suffer shortages after the war." "I know," Daenerys replied, her voice subdued, "but these people cannot be left to starve. The war took everything from them, their fields, their livestock, their families. We'll need to rely on what can be brought from Dorne. They have not been as affected by the cold." She felt a dull ache twist in her chest. There was little comfort in sharing meager supplies. The entire continent was ravaged by war. The doom had not been partial. It had come for all. Still, they had to try. She could not allow the realm she had sworn to protect to slide into famine. With a weary sigh, she passed a hand over her brow, as though trying to wipe away the dreadful weight of responsibility. Missandei touched Daenerys' arm gently, then withdrew her hand, for even light contact sent a prickle of cold jolting through her fingertips. "I'll make the arrangements. Grey Worm's men—" She paused, pain flickering in her eyes. The mention of Grey Worm was still raw. They had lost him at Moat Cailin. "The Unsullied who remain will help guard the shipments. The roads are dangerous." Daenerys nodded. "Yes, do that." Her throat constricted. She managed a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, Missandei, for everything." Missandei bowed her head once more, then departed, leaving Daenerys with her thoughts. She felt the presence behind her before she saw him. Jon stepped closer, wearing the black leathers of the north, which bore faint patches of older bloodstains from battles that felt a lifetime ago. He offered a tight smile, acknowledging Missandei as she passed by him, then turned to Daenerys. "I'm sending patrols to Harrenhal," Jon said softly, a note of exhaustion threading his words. "There are reports of an entire village there being attacked by what might be stray whites. Could be bandits or it could be truth. We can't take chances." She nodded. "Let the patrols handle it. The realm relies on you, Jon." The subtle shift of his eyes told her he understood her hidden meaning. The realm still trusted him more than they trusted her. Their love for him had only grown stronger in the war. For a time, that knowledge had weighed heavily on her, stirring envy and bitterness. Yet she had come to a quiet acceptance of it. Whatever claim she had once pressed for the Iron Throne felt distant, overshadowed by the guilt of her actions under the Night King's control, and by a new sense of responsibility for the devastation that had followed. She forced a tight smile. "How are the men holding up?" "They seem thin, but resolved." "They're exhausted," Jon replied. "The entire realm is exhausted. But we can't rest until we're sure all the undead are gone." Another wave of snow came down from the far north last week. "It's unnatural, Dany. The Maesters say winter shouldn't last this long, not even after a decade of summer. Some believe remnants of the White Walker's magic might be keeping the cold lingering." She thought of the chill in her own body. They could be right. Perhaps I can help remedy it. Jon's expression tensed. He knew what that implied. Daenerys using what remained of her ice powers, the same powers that had nearly doomed them all. She felt his concern radiate. He never voiced outright that he feared she might lose control again, but she sensed that fear just the same. She could not blame him. Though he loved her, the memory of her as a vessel of winter's darkness was impossible to forget. "All things in time," Jon said after a pause. "We have enough to manage simply feeding people and rebuilding roads." She inclined her head. They walked together across the muddy field, weaving through clusters of refugees. Some recognized them, dropping into shallow bows. Others clutched children to their sides and looked on with suspicion or sorrow. Daenerys offered what reassurances she could, yet the heavy swirl of her cloak and the frost still clinging to the fringe of her hair made her seem more specter than savior. They reached a small gathering of wagons where Tyrion Lannister paced back and forth, a ledger clutched in his hand. He wore thick gloves and a fur-lined cloak that dragged in the mud. Spotting Daenerys and Jon, he waved them over with mild exasperation. "Your Grace, your Grace," Tyrion said, stumbling momentarily as he addressed Jon, still navigating the question of what title best fit him these days. Jon was a king in the north once, but the lines of authority had blurred since the war. "There's been an issue with the distribution tallies. A few wagons never arrived, and the Stormlanders who were supposed to send them claim they were attacked on the road." Jon frowned. "Attacked by whom?" Tyrion shrugged, his brow furrowed. "They say it could have been Ironborn marauders. Lady Yara Greyjoy is supposedly controlling the Iron Islands effectively now, but some reaving crews might still ignore her authority. It could just as easily be outlaws wearing stolen Kraken sigils. Either way, the supplies are gone." Daenerys tightened her jaw. "We can't afford to lose supply trains, Tyrion. You know how dire the situation is. Do we have men to spare for an investigation?" "Not many," Tyrion admitted, glancing at the ledger again. "Most able-bodied troops are already scattered across the realm, chasing after rumored pockets of whites, escorting food wagons, or holding strategic points to keep the peace. Many lords have lost their entire retinues. In the Crownlands, the gold cloaks are barely functioning as a city watch. Even King's Landing is teetering on the edge of chaos, what with so many refugees flooding in." Daenerys exhaled, the breath pluming with faint cold in the air. "We'll send a small group to track them. They must be found and dealt with, whether they're Ironborn or bandits. We cannot allow the roads to remain unsafe." Jon placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. She felt the warmth of him, so different from the frost that still afflicted her. "We'll handle it," he assured Tyrion. "Perhaps we can also send ravens to Yara Greyjoy. She's proven herself an ally in the past. If there are rogue Ironborn, she'd want to know." Tyrion nodded. "Yes, I'll do that at once." He paused, then offered a thin smile. "We'll figure this out. We always do. The list of problems might be endless, but solutions do exist." Daenerys watched Tyrion trudge off, still scribbling notes in his ledger. She sighed. Once upon a time, the small councils in King's Landing had bickered over petty matters: taxes on wine, the handling of port fees. Now they were faced with an entire kingdom in tatters, a population decimated, and a winter that refused to break. She wondered if the realm would ever remember how to laugh, or if it had become permanently steeped in mourning. As she and Jon turned back toward the main cluster of survivors, a distant roar overhead drew their attention. She craned her neck to see Drogon wheeling in the sky, colossal wings beating against stubborn gusts of wind. The massive black dragon circled once, unleashing a mighty call that rattled the clouds. He had grown leaner, more scarred from the war, yet he remained formidable, the living symbol of Targaryen power. Behind him, smaller in frame, flew Regal. Daenerys felt a pang at the sight of them, a surge of love mixed with sorrow for the fallen Viserion. "Drogon still searches for you," Jon said gently, noticing her expression. "He rarely strays too far these days." She nodded, swallowing hard. "He can sense my turmoil. The bond between us remains, though it's overshadowed by other powers." She lifted a hand, and a delicate swirl of frost danced across her palm, then melted away as she dismissed the trick of magic. She hated how natural it felt now, to summon that cold with a mere thought. Jon pulled her closer. "You saved us all, Daenerys. Without what you did, the Night King would have gone on destroying everything." She accepted his embrace, but her eyes remained on the sky. "I nearly destroyed it all, too, Jon." His expression showed pain at the memory. He had seen the aftermath of Moat Cailin, the terror on the faces of those who realized she was commanding ice against them, even if unwillingly. But he also remembered the moment she had shattered the Night King with that spear, driven by her last vestige of free will. "We can't change the past," he said softly, as if repeating a mantra he told himself often. "We can only set a better course for the future." She wondered if that was truly possible. Even if the people forgave her, could she forgive herself? Could she reconcile the sliver of darkness she still felt inside, a lingering echo of the Night King's dominion? They parted ways shortly after, Jon off to tend to the tasks of reorganizing the patrols, Daenerys to speak with the small folk who needed reassurance. She moved from wagon to wagon, offering quiet words of hope, aware that her presence still induced a hush among the crowd. Some people did bow, though it was an uneasy gesture. Others simply stared. She knelt beside a young girl whose mother had perished when their farm was overrun by whites. The girl trembled, hugging a threadbare doll. Daenerys tried to speak, but the lump in her throat choked the words. She gently touched the girl's cheek, willing a spark of warmth into her hand instead of the frost that wanted to manifest. For once, it worked. The girl's tears slowed, and she reached out to grip Daenerys' hand, as if searching for comfort. That small success buoyed Daenerys' spirits. If she could yet summon warmth, even a little, perhaps there was hope for the future. When she rose to continue her rounds, she noticed the child's father watching intently, tears in his eyes. He gave Daenerys a nod of genuine gratitude. She responded with a solemn inclination of her head. It was a moment of fragile connection in a world still reeling from darkness. With the distribution finished for the day and the patrol set, Daenerys prepared to depart the makeshift camp. Though the survivors begged her to stay longer, she insisted her presence was required elsewhere. Reports of new threats demanded swift response. She offered what encouragement she could, then summoned Drogon and Rhaegal from the sky. Their landing stirred a flurry of wind and dust, sending cloaks flapping. Carefully, Daenerys climbed onto Drogon's back, ignoring the prickle of cold that flowed between them. She felt the subtle mismatch. He was a creature of fire. She was touched by ice. Yet he still accepted her, still recognized her as his mother. Jon mounted Rhaegal with practiced ease, though the dragon shifted restlessly, remembering battles past. Together, they took to the sky, leaving the field of refugees behind. Below them, the riverlands stretched wide, the rolling farmland marred by the scars of war. Burnt-out husks of villages peppered the horizon, while columns of smoke still curled from distant homesteads. Daenerys' heart constricted at the sheer scale of devastation. She had once fantasized about bringing peace to Westeros by overthrowing tyrants. But the realm's torments had multiplied beyond anything she could have foreseen. They flew south for half a day, the cold wind biting at Daenerys' cheeks. She felt an edge of exhaustion behind her eyes, but she pressed on, guided by the shimmering presence of Jon at her side. Their dragons soared over the Trident, that fateful river that had witnessed the death of her brother Rhaegar and, decades later, the defeat of the White Walkers. The water below was partially frozen, unusual for this time of year. The biting winter had not relinquished its hold. Daenerys thought grimly that perhaps her own presence was keeping the cold entrenched. She prayed that was not the case. Eventually, the hulking walls of Harrenhal came into view. Once the grandest fortress in Westeros, it now stood as a blackened shell, its melted towers looming over the shore of the God's Eye. Dragons had once destroyed Harrenhal centuries ago, turning its stone towers into grotesque lumps. It was said to be cursed, and after the recent war, it looked more forsaken than ever. Daenerys spotted columns of men patrolling the walls, presumably those loyal to the new caretaker, a lesser lord who had claimed governance in the aftermath of the war. The presence of so many armed figures suggested either fear or something more sinister. She guided Drogon to land in the expansive courtyard, blackened rubble crunching beneath the dragon's claws. Soldiers scrambled back, unsure whether to treat the arriving pair as saviors or conquerors. Daenerys slid down from Drogon's side, her posture regal despite her fatigue. Jon dismounted regal beside her. A hush fell over the courtyard, broken only by the rasp of swords being sheathed or the clank of armor as men backed away. Even after all that had happened, the sight of two living dragons was enough to quail the bravest hearts. A tall, lean knight approached, helm tucked under one arm. His weathered face bore several scars, and his surcoat displayed the device of a minor riverland's house. 3 bull rushes on a field of brown. He bowed stiffly. "Your grace, your graces," he corrected, eyes flickering to Jon. "We did not expect a royal visit." Daenerys dipped her head. "We came to investigate reports of whites in the area." She glanced around the courtyard, noticing the tension etched on every guard's face. "Have you seen anything that suggests a lingering undead threat?" The knight hesitated, then cleared his throat. "There have been sightings on the far side of the God's Eye. A fisherfolk village vanished overnight. No bodies were found, only signs of struggle. Tracks led north, but we lost them in the marshes." Jon exchanged a glance with Daenerys, then looked back at the knight. "Send a guide to show us the location. We'll see what can be done." The man bowed again, but his eyes lingered on Daenerys' face, reflecting a mixture of awe and unease at the faint trace of frost around her temples. He quickly departed, barking orders to the soldiers behind him. Daenerys and Jon made their way toward the shadow of the courtyard's main tower, intending to wait until the guide was ready. Along the way, groups of men and women parted, whispering in hushed tones as they passed. The gloom of Harrenhal pressed upon Daenerys. The melted stone towers, rumored to house ghosts, seemed almost to watch her with dark eyes. In the gloom of a broken archway, she spotted a group of children peering out, wide-eyed, at the dragons. It brought to mind the promise she had once cherished, to break the wheel to bring a kinder rule. And now here she stood, haunted by a power she barely controlled, in a realm that had seen nothing but war and endless cold. Tyrion had once told her that leadership required the ability to inspire, to give people hope even when circumstances were dire. She felt as though her capacity for hope had nearly run dry, yet she forced herself to stand tall. Perhaps that, in itself, could help rekindle belief in something better. Within the hour, a small band of soldiers gathered near the gate, accompanied by the knight who had greeted them and 2 local guides. These guides were brothers, both wiry and sharp-eyed, each wearing worn leather boots caked in mud. They carried short bows, their quivers filled with arrows tipped in dragonglass. Daenerys approved. Lessons learned from the war with the undead were not so quickly forgotten. She and Jon mounted their dragons once more, leaving some of Harrenhal's garrison behind to maintain order. The guides rode on horseback, leading the soldiers along the winding trail around the God's Eye. From above, Daenerys watched them weave through marshy ground, occasionally sinking to their knees in mud. She appreciated that they continued onward despite the difficulty, desperate to discover what fate had befallen the fisherfolk. The journey took them along the southern shore of the vast lake, where the air grew damp and heavy. Strange calls echoed across the water, birds, frogs, or other creatures hidden among the reeds. The cold wind swept across the reeds, bending them in waves of dull green. Daenerys eyed the thick stands of trees beyond, imagining how easily whites could lurk in such terrain. Memories of the endless northern snows rose unbidden in her mind. She forced them down, focusing on the mission. By late afternoon, they spotted the ruins of a small village perched on a patch of dry land near the water's edge. Smoke curled from the remains of huts and boathouses, too faint to be recent. The place was eerily silent. Even Drogon seemed reluctant to land among the charred rubble. Daenerys coaxed him down, and Jon followed suit. The guides and soldiers approached warily, glancing over their shoulders as though expecting an ambush. Daenerys dismounted, stepping onto soil strewn with footprints and broken planks. She noticed that the ground bore signs of violence: scratches, bloodstains, hoofprints mixed with something else. The air smelled stale, as if the entire area had been vacated for days. She knelt, brushing her fingers over a patch of dried blood. The frost in her veins pulsed, reacting to a faint residue of the undead. She grimaced, letting out a measured breath. John crouched beside her, scanning the footprints. Some belonged to horses, others, hard to say. One of the guides spoke, his voice tense. "We found half-eaten fish in the huts, bowls still on tables. It was as if they vanished in the middle of supper. Never seen tracks like these, though. Not exactly human." The group spread out, searching for clues. Soldiers poked through the ruined huts, the remains of overturned canoes, and even the shallow water at the edge of the lake. Daenerys felt a prickle along her spine, as though something watched from the looming treeline. She turned to stare at the silent ranks of willows and oaks. Could whites lie in wait among the roots? The night approached, looking grim. Whatever happened here, it wasn't just the dead. These folks put up a fight. Arrows in some of the walls, arrows tipped with dragonglass. From the look of it, they must have known to prepare for an undead threat. But the tracks indicate a group of living people too, or something else. There's no telling what they encountered. Daenerys felt the creeping tension in the air. The war was over, the White Walkers defeated, but that did not mean peace reigned. Bandits, deserters, or unscrupulous opportunists might have exploited the chaos, and the whites that remained could be following their own aimless cruelty. She scanned the huts again, uneasy. John stood near the largest structure, likely the village's communal hall. He pulled aside a charred door and stepped within. Daenerys followed. The interior was dark, the roof partially collapsed, letting in slivers of late afternoon sunlight. Broken chairs and tables lay scattered across the dirt floor. A battered cooking pot rested on its side, rusted from the damp. John bent to pick up a small carving, a wooden figurine shaped like a fish. He turned it over in his hands. "Children lived here," he murmured, "and they left everything behind." Daenerys closed her eyes, remembering the child she had comforted that morning in the refugee camp. How many more would lose their homes or vanish in the night if they did not bring order and safety to the realm? She opened her eyes and found John watching her, empathy in his gaze. He knew how deeply these failures pained her. He replaced the carving gently on the broken table. "Come," John said, voice low. "There's nothing more for us here. We'll send word to the nearest lords. Have them search the lake's perimeter. If there are whites, we'll find them." Daenerys nodded, turning to leave. But just then, the frost in her veins rippled, and she sensed something beyond the threshold of the hall. She froze. A wave of cold emanated from her chest, unbidden, and she fought to keep it from leaking into her limbs. John noticed her sudden tension, stepping closer. "What is it?" She could not find the words. Instead, she emerged from the hall into the open air. Sunset glowed on the horizon, painting the god's eye in gold. The soldiers had begun to regroup near the dragons, exchanging uncertain glances. The villagers' footprints led north, so the guides pointed that direction, murmuring that a search would be best begun at dawn. Yet Daenerys could not shake the feeling that something was very near, and watching. She took a few steps toward the treeline. The night started to call after her, but John held up a hand, letting her proceed. Her boots pressed into the damp soil. The grasses near the water's edge rustled with every shift of breeze. She stepped over a fallen boat, its hull splintered. There, just beyond the logs stacked for a fire that had never been lit, she saw a single footprint, large and misshapen. It almost looked like a man's foot, except the toes were elongated, the arch too high, the heel twisted. Ice prickled along her wrists. She crouched, brushing her fingertips against the print. It was deep, recent, a faint recollection of old tales about half-human creatures or monstrous apparitions flickered in her mind. But reason told her to suspect a white or a mutated abomination left over from the war. As she studied the footprint, a snarl cut through the stillness of the evening. She looked up sharply, scanning the thick brush. The soldiers nearby whirled, drawing swords. One guide raised his bow, arrow nocked, scanning for a target. Drogon shifted his wings and hissed low, as if sensing a threat. Another snarl, louder this time. Then something emerged from the underbrush, a hulking figure with tattered clothing and pale, mottled skin. Its eyes glowed faintly blue, like a white's, but it moved with a strange fluidity. Daenerys recoiled in horror. It resembled a man twisted by unnatural magic, its limbs elongated, nails sharpened into claws. Tattered hair hung in clumps around a face that was more beast than human. With a wet gasp, it lunged forward. A cry rang out among the soldiers. They rushed to intercept, but the creature moved with startling speed. It swiped at the nearest man, rending armor and flesh in a single blow. The poor soldier collapsed, blood gushing from a torn artery. Daenerys sprang to her feet, calling out to Jon, who sprinted toward the creature with long claw in hand. In the chaos, Daenerys realized more shapes were moving in the shadows among the reeds. Pale forms drifted closer, snarling, shambling. Some looked like whites, their eyes a dull, lifeless blue, but a few were twisted in the same manner as the first creature, half-human abominations possessed of cunning. Whether they were a new breed of undead or living beings corrupted by the Night King's leftover magic, Daenerys could not tell. All she knew was that they came at them in a wave of guttural fury. The knight shouted commands, urging the men to form a line, but the terrain made it difficult. The creatures had the advantage of camouflage and speed. One abomination tackled a soldier, biting into his neck with horrifying ferocity. Another snapped a spear in half, tossing the broken shaft aside. Daenerys felt panic surge in the pit of her stomach. This was no ordinary fight against mindless whites. These brutes displayed a terrifying intelligence, communicating with each other through growls and snarls. Jon drove his Valyrian steel blade into the chest of one creature, which shrieked and fell back, bits of foul liquid spraying from its mouth. Another tried to flank him, but he spun, slicing into its spine, collapsed, twitching. Daenerys took a step forward, intending to use her advantage as a Targaryen, Dragonfire. But she hesitated, remembering the last time she had tried to use her powers in close quarters. That was the old Daenerys, the Queen of Dragons who commanded flame. Now she had become something else, her fire overshadowed by the chill that twisted in her blood. Still, she focused on Drogon, summoning him with a sharp whistle. The black dragon roared and bounded forward, flattening the reeds, but a pair of the twisted creatures leapt at his flank, clawing at his scales in a frenzy. Drogon bellowed in pain, thrashing. Daenerys' heart lurched. She could not allow them to harm him. She extended her hand, intending to shout, "Dracarys!" as she had done so many times before, yet her lungs refused to form the word. Instead, a ghostly chill rushed from her lips. Ice formed in the air, swirling like a storm. In a heartbeat, jagged shards of frost coalesced around the two creatures assailing Drogon. The shards shattered outward, ripping through their flesh. They screeched, flailing, pinned by spikes of translucent ice. Daenerys stared in horror, her chest heaving. She had summoned a lethal blast of cold without meaning to. A wave of nausea twisted her stomach, and she turned away, pressing a hand to her mouth. Drogon shook off the impaled creatures and snapped his jaws around one of their torsos, crushing it. Jon, glancing over, saw the remnants of Daenerys' conjured ice. He cut down another abomination, then shouted to the men, "Use dragon glass. Aim for the head or chest. These things might still follow white rules." At his command, soldiers switched tactics, brandishing dragonglass-dipped spears and arrows. One by one, they brought the creatures down. The monster that had attacked the first soldier fell to an arrow through its eye. Another had its skull pierced by a spear. As each abomination collapsed, it did not simply lie still. Its flesh seemed to wither, crumbling into a slushy residue that reeked of decay. Daenerys' stomach turned at the sight. Within minutes, the ambush was over. A handful of wounded soldiers groaned in the mud. 3 men lay dead, including the soldier who had taken that first brutal swipe. The rest panted and stumbled about, checking to see if more creatures lurked in the reeds. None appeared. The only sounds now were the rasp of breath, the crackle of ice shards dissolving in the last of the sunlight, and the distant call of marsh birds. Daenerys forced herself to swallow her revulsion, stepping toward Jon as he wiped gore from Longclaw. "These things," she began, voice trembling. "They're like whites, but different. Could the Night King's magic have created more horrors than we knew?" Jon's expression was grim. "It's possible. Or they might be the result of something else. We know the children of the forest once made the White Walkers. Who's to say other twisted forms don't wander the land? And the Night King's hold might have lingered in places, warping men into these abominations." Daenerys shuddered. She felt the ice in her blood pulse again, as though resonating with the monstrous aura that had enveloped the clearing. She hated the sensation, hated that it felt almost familiar. She looked around, struggling to center herself. The men were placing the bodies of their fallen comrades near a burnt boat, preparing to carry them back for a proper burial if possible. The creatures had dissolved into vile puddles, leaving no solid remains to burn. "Sire," Daenerys said to the knight who led Harrenhal's garrison, "have your men search the area. There may be more." Her tone was cold, resolute. She could not allow fear to paralyze her. The knight, though shaken, saluted. "At once, Your Grace." Daenerys and Jon moved to the side of the clearing where Drogon and Rhaegal waited, the dragons glaring at the reeds as if expecting another attack. Jon checked the lacerations on Drogon's flank. They were shallow, but the dragon hissed with irritation. Rhaegal let out a low rumble, as though scolding Drogon for letting the creatures get so close. Daenerys laid a trembling hand on Drogon's scales, whispering an apology. Once again, the friction between the dragon's fiery essence and her unnatural chill radiated in her veins. Drogon softened under her touch. He still recognized her, no matter how changed she was. Jon turned to Daenerys, wiping sweat from his brow. "We can't let these abominations roam freely. If there are more, we need to destroy them. They could terrorize the entire Riverlands." "I agree," Daenerys said. She glanced at the horizon, where the sun sank in molten amber. "But we can't fight them in the dark. We should secure the area and camp at Harrenhal for the night. At first light, we'll mount a proper search." He nodded. "I'll speak to the knight about reinforcing patrols around the lake. And we need to send word to every nearby lord about these creatures." Daenerys cast another look at the puddles of foul slush. She fought a wave of nausea. "Yes, do that. The realm has endured too much. We won't let another horror spread." Night fell swiftly, and the group returned to Harrenhal under starless skies, the fortress looming like a broken colossus. Guards lit torches along the walls, their flickering glow revealing crumbling stone and deep shadows. Within the inner ward, the knight arranged meager accommodations. The entire fortress felt like a mausoleum, haunted by echoes of dragons past. Daenerys allowed a few servants to lead her and Jon to a half-intact tower chamber where a small fire crackled in a makeshift hearth. The furniture was sparse, just a battered table, 2 chairs, and a lumpy bedroll. Yet it was better than sleeping in the courtyard. The old keepers of Harrenhal had not had time to restore its once mighty halls after the war. Jon shrugged off his cloak, hanging it from a rusted hook. Daenerys stood near the fire, trying to warm herself. But the flames felt distant, as though the cold in her blood blunted their heat. She gazed into the embers, thinking about the savage ambush that had nearly cost them more lives. Could the Night King's influence still poison the land even after his demise? And what role did she, as a carrier of that magic, play in containing or exacerbating it? Jon approached quietly, his presence a calm reassurance. "You're trembling," he said, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. He frowned at the chill radiating from her skin. "Dany, you should rest." She turned to him, eyes filled with the weight of her fears. "Rest eludes me, Jon. I used that power again. Felt almost easy. Every time I invoke it, I risk losing more of myself." He drew her into his arms, careful to ignore the discomfort of her cold aura. You're still you. You broke free of the Night King's control. You can use what remains of that magic to protect, not to harm." She let out a ragged breath, leaning her head against his chest. "I want to believe that, yet what if the realm itself is rejecting me? This unnatural winter continues to cling to Westeros. Whites linger in corners we haven't searched. Now these twisted monstrosities appear." Her voice faltered. "Sometimes I feel I should leave the country, take this curse with me, let the land heal. Perhaps then the winter would break." His arms tightened around her. "Don't say that. You're needed here. I'm needed here. We stand a better chance together. Running away won't solve the realm's problems, nor will it cure you of this curse." He tilted her chin upward so she met his gaze. "We'll find a way, perhaps with the help of the maesters, the Red Priests, or any other knowledge we can unearth. We faced the Night King and survived. We can face this too." She managed a faint smile. It was a fragile hope, but a hope nonetheless. Daenerys closed her eyes and allowed herself a moment of stillness in Jon's embrace. The crackle of the fire undercut the hush of the ruined tower. Somewhere in the distance, she heard the muffled sound of men talking, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer working late into the night to repair broken weapons. Life went on, battered but unbowed. They shared a humble meal of bread and a thin stew, provided by the Harrenhal cooks who seemed amazed to be cooking for royalty again. Afterward, they laid down on the bedroll. Jon fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the day's events. But Daenerys lay awake, staring at the flickering shadows on the stone walls. The swirl of ice magic within her throbbed in an odd rhythm, as if responding to unseen currents. She wondered if the night was truly still or if more horrors lurked beyond the fortress walls. Eventually, fatigue overtook her, and she drifted into troubled dreams. She saw herself in the Godswood of Winterfell, kneeling on frosted ground as the Night King stood behind her, silent and implacable. She tried to stand, but her limbs felt encased in ice. She heard distant roars of dragons, felt the warmth of their flames nearing, yet she could not escape the cold. She turned to look at him, expecting to see his dreadful countenance. Instead, she saw her own reflection in his icy armor. Her face was twisted, half her flesh encased in bluish ice, the other half blackened as if burned. She jolted awake, a sheen of cold sweat on her brow. The fire had burned low in the hearth, leaving only embers. Jon still slept, his breathing steady. Daenerys slowly pushed herself up, hugging her knees. She tried to quiet her frantic heartbeats, reminding herself that the Night King was gone, shattered into fragments of ice. She was free, but why did it feel as though her mind was still chained to that glacial presence? Morning came without the warmth of the sun, thick clouds smothering the sky. A bitter wind blew through the courtyard as Daenerys and Jon rallied the men for a more thorough search. Mounted knights, foot soldiers, and a handful of archers set out around the God's Eye, seeking any sign of other twisted creatures or survivors from the vanished fisherfolk. Daenerys flew overhead with Drogon, scanning the marshes from above. Jon followed on regal. The combined efforts yielded little but more questions. They found an abandoned campsite near the far shore, evidence that a larger group of survivors had passed through days earlier, but no sign of fresh tracks. By noon, the troop returned to Harrenhal, weary and frustrated. The knight in charge of the garrison suggested dispatching ravens to every nearby lord, urging them to keep watch for similar abominations. Jon approved, and the men busied themselves with writing messages under Tyrion's oversight. Tyrion himself had arrived during the night with a small retinue, having hurried from the previous camp after hearing of the attack. Now he stood with Daenerys and Jon in the courtyard, tugging his gloves on and off in agitation. It could be that these creatures are a rare anomaly, Tyrion mused, his tone betraying little confidence. But after what we've endured, I'm loath to ignore any threat that could grow. Jon nodded grimly. We should treat it as if it might spread. If it's the Night King's leftover magic, it might fester in other regions. We need a more unified approach, not just local lords defending their lands. Daenerys's gaze drifted over the looming walls of Harrenhal. The battered fortress was a testament to the destructive legacy of dragons. And now, ironically, the realm might need dragons once more to protect them from a new horror. "We cannot rely solely on local alliances," she said quietly. "We need a council of regents or something akin to the old Targaryen monarchy structure, but more flexible. The realm is fractured. With the Iron Throne all but symbolic now, we must find a new way to unify the lords. Otherwise, bandits, twisted undead, or anything else will tear the realm apart." Her words hung in the cold air. Tyrion exhaled. Perhaps a great council, like the one that decided who would succeed King Maegor centuries ago. Bring the lords, ladies, and major powers together to discuss the future. Decide on leadership or at least a coherent plan. But that would require them to trust us enough to attend. Jon looked pensive. "We have to try. The lords might be suspicious, but none can deny we were the ones who ended the White Walkers. And even if some resent Daenerys or fear her, they cannot deny the dragons. They still serve as a powerful deterrent against any who would break peace. And we need that deterrent now." Tyrion blew into his cupped hands to warm them. "We'll send invitations to the major houses. Stark in the north, Arryn in the Vale, Tarly in the Reach, Baratheon in the Stormlands, Martell in Dorne, Greyjoy in the Iron Islands. And, of course, any other significant lords who hold sway. We convene them in King's Landing, or perhaps a neutral location if that's more palatable." Daenerys shook her head. "King's Landing is still the heart of the realm. The throne may be a husk of its former significance, but the city can accommodate the delegates." She hesitated, shoulders sagging. "I only wonder if they'll come." "They will," Jon said. "They can't rebuild alone. They need alliances, trade, and a stable peace. If we can promise them safety from any new threat, and from each other, they'll come." So it was decided. Tyrion would depart at once to coordinate the sending of ravens, while Daenerys and Jon would continue scouring for undead threats. They aimed to reconvene in King's Landing in a fortnight, hoping by then that the houses would have heeded the summons. The journey ahead was fraught with uncertainty, but it was a plan, perhaps the only plan that made sense. Daenerys spent the remainder of the day assisting the Harrenhal garrison with repairs to the fortress's shattered gates. She used the faint measure of ice magic at her disposal carefully, freezing broken stones in place to serve as a temporary seal. The men watched in a mixture of astonishment and trepidation, but her efforts worked. The walls would hold until a prop or mason could attend to them. Each time she wielded that power, her veins throbbed with cold, reminding her of the line she walked. She prayed she would not succumb to the darkness again. By evening, she and Jon prepared to depart. Tyrion would remain a day longer, ensuring the ravens were sent properly, then ride south. The courtyard bustled with soldiers packing supplies. Daenerys gave a last, solemn farewell to the knight in command, thanking him for his service. He bowed, still clearly unsettled by her presence, but respectful. Harrenhal would stand, for now. The dragons soared into the twilight sky, bearing Daenerys and Jon toward their next destination, the Stormlands. Rumors suggested that new outbreaks of whites had occurred near the Rainwood, harrying local villagers. If the rumors were true, they intended to help. If they proved false, they would still reassure the region of their vigil. Flying east, they spent long hours above rolling fields and thick forests, the horizon painted in shades of purple and gold. Daenerys kept a measured distance from Jon, letting her thoughts wander to what might happen at the forthcoming Great Council. Would the lords demand her abdication? Would they call for a new king entirely? Jon might have the strongest claim now that word of his lineage had spread. Yet he abhorred the notion of ruling from the Iron Throne. Then again, the realm might require a reluctant king more than an ambitious one. The air cooled further as night fell. They landed in a sheltered clearing near a stream, deciding it was too dangerous to continue in darkness. The region was lawless these days, with bandits and stray undead a constant threat. Building a small fire, they shared dried rations and silent reflections. Drogon and Regal curled protectively around the clearing, their massive bodies radiating comforting heat. Daenerys leaned against Drogon's flank, letting the faint warmth chase away the deeper chill in her bones. Jon sat beside her, the firelight casting flickering shadows on his face. "Do you remember?" he said quietly. "The first time I took flight on a dragon's back?" She smiled, recalling how uncertain he had been, how he had clung to the scales with white-knuckled determination. "You hid your terror well. I thought you might faint." A faint chuckle escaped him. "I almost did. I'd never experienced such a rush of freedom and fear. It made me realize how small we are compared to the scope of this world." Daenerys nodded, running her hand gently over Drogon's scales. The friction of ice and fire was palpable, but less jarring when the dragon's body heat was so strong. It was simpler then. Our greatest worry was persuading people that the threat in the north was real. We had no idea how dark things would become. He draped an arm around her shoulders. "We've come so far and endured so much. It's hard to imagine what tomorrow will bring. But I find some comfort in knowing we face it together." She rested her head against his shoulder, letting a weary sigh slip out. "For the sake of the realm," she whispered. "For the sake of all who still depend on us." They fell into a contemplative silence, the crackle of the fire lulling them into a fragile sense of calm. Night creatures stirred in the forest, and the dragons periodically lifted their heads, sniffing the air. But no threats emerged. Eventually, Daenerys dozed, lulled by the presence of Jon at her side and the protective stance of her dragons. At dawn, they took to the skies again. The Stormlands lay southeast, a rugged terrain of crags, forests, and rolling hills battered by frequent storms from the narrow sea. House Baratheon's seat at Storm's End still stood, its thick walls defiant against the elements. When Daenerys and Jon arrived by Dragonback, they found a garrison on alert. The Stormlanders, led by a distant cousin of the late King Robert Baratheon, had mustered their men, apparently spurred by the same rumors of undead infiltration. The castellan who managed Storm's End greeted them with a stiff bow. He was a wiry man named Ser Herald, bearing no small resemblance to the Baratheons in the dark hair and broad shoulders. "Your Graces," he said warily, "we've heard word you might be traveling this way. There are indeed reports of whites in the Rainwood, though we've yet to confirm." Jon nodded. "How far into the forest?" Ser Herald gestured toward the southwestern horizon, where dark green treetops stretched for miles. "Scouts claim to have spotted undead near the old ruins by the sea cliffs, about a day's ride from here. But no one has returned with proof." Daenerys frowned. "We'll check it ourselves. Better to be certain than to let them run rampant." Ser Herald bowed, clearly relieved to have dragon riders at his disposal. "We can muster a small force to guide you, Your Grace, if it pleases you." "That would be helpful," Jon replied. "We'll leave at once." Within the hour, a group of Baratheon soldiers, clad in steel and bearing the crowned stag sigil, accompanied Daenerys and Jon into the Rainwood. While the dragons could overfly much of it, the dense canopy made direct observation difficult. They decided that half their number would proceed on foot to search the undergrowth, while Daenerys and Jon circled above, scanning for signs of disturbance or paths trodden by the undead. The rain began soon after they entered the wood, a light drizzle that quickly became a pounding storm, typical of the Stormlands. It drenched the forest floor, turning it slick and treacherous. Daenerys guided Drogon through the heavy gusts, thunder rumbling overhead. Flashes of lightning illuminated the swirling canopy below. She caught glimpses of the soldiers, their torches sputtering in the wet air, pressing onward with unwavering dedication. Jon flew parallel on Regal, exchanging signals with her whenever they spotted anything unusual. But for hours, they saw no trace of whites or abominations. Eventually, the storm grew too fierce for flight. Drenched and weary, they sat down in a clearing where the soldiers had paused to rest and light fires. The thick canopy overhead provided partial shelter, though raindrops still trickled through. Daenerys dismounted, ignoring the squelch of mud beneath her boots. The men looked exhausted, their cloaks soaked through. She approached them, raising her voice over the roar of the rain. "We'll make camp here for the night. Keep the fires burning and post double sentries. If there are undead in this forest, they might sense our presence." The soldiers nodded, grateful for the respite. They began assembling tents from oilcloth and rope, forming a rough circle around the clearing's perimeter. Drogon and Regal found spots on higher ground to settle, their scales glistening with rain. Daenerys ventured under a broad oak, the thick branches offering some shelter. She found Jon there, wringing water from his hair. "No luck from the sky," he said, frustration evident. "Either the rumor was false, or the whites are hiding too well." Daenerys considered the swirling gloom of the rainwood, the primal hush broken only by rain. "We'll continue searching in daylight. The storm might ease by then." She reached out to touch Jon's sleeve, feeling the damp fabric. "You're soaked." He gave a half-smile. "You're hardly dry yourself." She glanced down at her dripping cloak. A wry chuckle escaped her. The moment felt almost absurd. Two monarchs, battered by storms and haunted by shadows, soaked like common travelers. "At least it isn't snow," she said, though the mention of snow sent a faint chill through her blood. They parted to help the soldiers establish a secure camp. Daenerys found herself near a circle of men trying to coax a fire from damp wood. She knelt beside them, noticing their grim faces. "Allow me," she said. In the past, she would have commanded Drogon to unleash a careful spurt of flame. But here, the canopy was too low, and the dragons were restless. Instead, she tried to summon a bit of heat on her own. Yet, when she closed her eyes, the cold in her veins surged reflexively, forming frost on the wet wood. She grimaced, pulling back. The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. She shook her head. "Let me try again." She inhaled, focusing not on the icy magic but on the memory of dragonfire, of stepping into flames and feeling no harm. For an agonizing moment, nothing happened. Then a faint warmth flickered in her palm. The frost that had formed on the log melted, and a small flame sparked. The soldiers gasped in astonishment, quickly feeding the fire with dry kindling they had kept wrapped in oilcloth. Within seconds, a modest blaze crackled, shedding blessed heat in the chilly rain. Daenerys leaned back, heart pounding. She had not summoned pure fire in months, ever since the ordeal with the Night King. The tiny flame felt exhilarating, proof that her own warmth had not been entirely extinguished. The soldiers murmured thanks, unmindful of her personal struggle. She moved away quietly, letting them enjoy the heat. Her hands trembled slightly from the effort, but she could not help a small smile. Perhaps she still had some measure of the fire that once defined her. Jon found her soon after, concern in his eyes. "I saw what you did," he said softly. "Are you all right?" She nodded, pushing a damp strand of hair from her face. "It was just a small flame, but it felt good." He squeezed her hand gently, mindful of the chill. "That's a start." His voice carried genuine pride. "We'll see if you can do more, without summoning ice by mistake. Maybe it's a sign your body is finding balance." Daenerys hoped he was right. Before they could speak further, a soldier hurried toward them, torch sputtering in the downpour. "My lord, my lady, Ser Herald summons you. There's something you should see." His tone was anxious. They followed, picking their way through the muddy clearing to a spot where the Baratheon castellan stood with a handful of men, torches raised. He pointed to a collapsed tree at the edge of the clearing. Beneath the gnarled roots, partially exposed by the rain-soaked soil, lay a tangle of bones. Not just human bones. Some were larger, twisted, bearing fang-like protrusions. Daenerys felt her stomach knot. "Could be the remains of some wild beast," Ser Herald ventured, but his voice shook. "Or something else." Jon knelt, brushing aside wet soil. He uncovered what appeared to be a skull, elongated, partially deformed. A chill pricked Daenerys' spine. It resembled the abominations they had fought near Harrenhal, though clearly the skeleton was older, the bones stained brown from the earth. The shape suggested a twisted mixture of human and beast. If such creatures had existed long before the Night King's recent resurgence, It implied the corruption ran deeper, or that old horrors lurked in the darkest corners of Westeros. "This is ancient," Jon said, frowning. "But how ancient?" One of the soldiers muttered a prayer to the Seven, backing away. Daenerys felt a surge of protectiveness for her people. How could they rebuild a world where monstrosities roamed, born of dark magic older than memory? "We'll bury it," she declared, voice tight. "No need to let it unnerve the men. We continue our search in the morning." Jon placed a hand on the skull, as though in silent farewell, then rose. Rain trickled from his hair, and in the torchlight, he looked grim as any half-forgotten king of old. "We keep watch tonight," he agreed. "If there's more in these woods, we'll find it or they'll find us." The men hastened to bury the bones. Daenerys watched them work, the flicker of torchlight revealing anxious faces. Whispers spread through the camp that the forest was cursed, that the storms were unnatural. Some even wondered if the gods were punishing Westeros for trifling with powers that should have remained buried. Dragons, White Walkers, the children's ancient sorceries. Daenerys felt the weight of their suspicions, remembering the ephemeral vow she had once made. To break the chains of slavery, to break the wheel of oppression. Now she walked a line between opposing magics, uncertain whether she was a liberator or a harbinger of more doom. She returned to the small fire she had helped kindle. Sitting on a damp log, she let the warmth lap at her hands. Drops of rain plunked from the leaves overhead, sizzling in the flames. Jon sat beside her, silent and watchful. The rest of the camp formed a protective circle. Men huddled in pairs under makeshift tarps. Dragons dozed fitfully in the shadows, occasionally raising their heads to snort at the storm. In that weary hush, Daenerys felt her mind drift to the forthcoming Great Council. She imagined the lords of Westeros gathered in the Red Keep's throne room, all gazing at her with suspicion or accusation. She saw Sansa Stark, proud and fiercely protective of the North, eyeing Daenerys's cold-laced aura warily. She imagined the Martells from Dorne, still grieving the losses from the war, uncertain if they could trust a Targaryen queen. She thought of the Tarlys in the Reach. Would they ever accept her after Randall and Dickon Tarly had met their ends in Dragonfire? So many old wounds bled into new suspicions. And overshadowing all of it was the question of the Iron Throne. Did she even want it anymore? Once, it had been her life's goal, a destiny promised by birthright. But now, the concept of ruling from that melted seat of power felt hollow. The realm needed leadership, certainly, but perhaps the shape of that leadership had to change. Perhaps the Seven Kingdoms required more than a single monarch who claimed absolute authority. She glanced at Jon. He stared into the flames, brow furrowed. She recalled how reluctant he had been to accept any claim to the throne, even after learning of his parentage. He wanted peace, security for the people, not the endless politics and betrayals that so often accompanied rule. If the Great Council chose him, how would he respond? Would she stand beside him, an advisor and partner, or would she clash with him over the shape of the new monarchy? She let out a slow breath. Whatever came, they would face it together, though it unsettled her to realize that, for all her ambition, she no longer saw herself alone on that throne. The ice in her veins reminded her of her own fragility. She was no longer certain she could guide the realm without risking more devastation. Guilt weighed heavily, scarring her conscience with memories of Winterfell's courtyard, Moat Caelan's fall, the unstoppable march of the undead that she had, in some twisted way, enabled. At length, they bedded down for the night, exhaustion trumping fear. Daenerys dozed in a light, fitful sleep, half listening for any sign of wights or abominations prowling outside the circle of torches. The storm eased near midnight, leaving a dripping hush over the rainwood. She dreamed again of icy landscapes, but this time, she saw a figure moving through the snow, a child with stark white hair, luminous and distant. When the child turned, Daenerys glimpsed blue eyes like the Night King's. She woke with a start, heart hammering. The torch beside her flickered. Nothing stirred beyond the quiet of the forest. At dawn, the search continued. The soldier patrols ranged deeper into the rainwood, checking old paths and abandoned watchtowers. Daenerys and Jon soared overhead. The day remained gray and damp, though the rain held off for a few hours. By midday, they found no trace of fresh undead activity, just the usual hazards of an untamed forest: wolves, boars, and scattered deer tracks. Ser Herald concluded the rumors were either exaggerated or the threat had moved on. With heavy hearts, Daenerys and Jon agreed. They could not remain indefinitely searching for phantoms. Reluctantly, they led the troops back toward Storm's End, where the Castellan thanked them profusely and promised to maintain vigilance. Daenerys offered words of caution about the twisted abominations sighted in the riverlands. Ser Herald pledged to rally more huntsmen, track any suspicious sightings, and keep a chain of ravens to King's Landing open. For now, it was all they could do. Their next destination was King's Landing itself. Enough time had passed that Tyrion should have arrived and begun preparations for the Great Council. Houses from across the realm would be deciding whether to attend. Daenerys felt a knot of anxiety at the prospect. Still, they had to proceed. The realm needed unity. They flew south along the coast, the sea whipping against rocky shores. The dragons took joy in the open air, occasionally diving low to startle seabirds. Daenerys felt a flicker of contentment at their exuberance. The world was still breathtaking in its own way, despite the scars of war. As they neared the Crownlands, the sky remained overcast, a heavy pall of clouds overshadowing the horizon. Finally, King's Landing came into view, a sprawling metropolis hugging the Blackwater Bay, its once imposing walls still bearing signs of damage from the war and the subsequent chaos. Refugee camps sprawled outside the city gates, muddy tent clusters where thousands who had fled the undead invasion now sought shelter. Smoke rose from countless fires, the smell of unwashed bodies mingling with the stench of the harbor's brine. Even from the air, Daenerys could sense the city's tension. The capital had never fully recovered from the war. Food shortages, overcrowding, and lingering fear weighed on the populace. Drogon descended toward the Red Keep, regal following. Guards on the walls shouted, hurrying to clear a landing area. Daenerys recalled the first time she had landed here with her dragons, triumphant at crossing the narrow sea. She had believed she was on the cusp of a glorious victory, poised to claim the Iron Throne. Now, her heart felt heavy with the knowledge that the city was in dire need of stable leadership, and that she might not be the one to provide it. She dismounted in the Red Keep's courtyard, where Tyrion, Missandei, and a small host of unsullied and city guards awaited. Tyrion stepped forward, a weary smile on his face. "You made it back in one piece. I trust the Stormlands were as rainy as ever." Daenerys gave a rueful shrug, wiping water from her brow. "They lived up to their name. No conclusive sign of whites, though we found unsettling remains in the forest." Jon dismounted regal, greeting Tyrion with a nod. "And the council?" Tyrion sighed, rubbing his temple. "The Ravenry hasn't stopped. Most major houses have agreed to send representatives. Some are reluctant, but necessity forces their hand. Sansa Stark is coming from Winterfell, though she warned it will be a journey given the state of the roads. Lord Royce is accompanying her. The Vale stands with the Starks for now. House Arryn is... well, it's complicated, but they'll at least hear us out." He led them inside, briefing them on more details as they traversed the once regal corridors of the Red Keep. Missandei followed silently, occasionally interjecting with logistical notes, where the delegates would stay, how the City Watch would handle security, and so forth. Daenerys noticed how the tapestries still hung in tatters. The extravagance of the Lannister regime had been replaced by bare survival. The Red Keep itself needed repairs, but resources were limited. As they passed through the throne room, Daenerys' steps slowed. The Iron Throne loomed at the far end, a mass of twisted swords hammered together centuries ago. A wave of conflicting emotions rolled over her. Once, she had imagined sitting there, triumphant, claiming her birthright. Now, the seat looked more like a relic of an arabesque left behind. She did not approach it. Instead, she walked on, ignoring the pang in her chest. Jon cast a sidelong glance, but said nothing. He understood her turmoil. Tyrion guided them to a council chamber. Inside, a handful of trusted allies awaited. Davos Seaworth Missandei, a few minor lords from the Crownlands, and a scattering of scribes. The tension in the room eased only slightly when Daenerys and Jon entered. They were greeted with polite bows, though the wariness was evident. "Your Graces," Davos said. "Glad to see you back safely. The city's bracing for the influx of delegates. I've never seen so many from so many places." Daenerys took a seat at the head of the table, an old reflex. Jon sat beside her. She noticed the subtle shifting of the lords, as though they wondered which of the two truly commanded. She drew a breath and addressed them with calm authority. "How many have arrived already?" A scribe cleared his throat. "Representatives from Dorne arrived this morning, led by Lady Maria Martell. She's the sister of the late prince who fell in the war against the dead. She's accompanied by a retinue of spearmen and advisors. The Tarleys from the Reach are en route. Rumor says they'll be here in 2 days. The Vale's lords are traveling with Lady Sansa, likely to arrive within the fortnight. The Westerlands remain uncertain. Some lesser Lannisters are rumored to come, but we've had no direct word from them yet. The Iron Islands have sent an envoy from Lady Yara Greyjoy, though she isn't here herself," Tyrion interjected. "And we expect the Baratheon claimant, Gendry, who was legitimized by royal decree some time ago, to arrive soon. He's been forging alliances in the Stormlands, though he's still quite new to leadership." Jon nodded slowly. "We should meet with them as they arrive, one by one, to gauge their moods. This council won't be easy. Old grudges run deep." Daenerys offered a faint smile. "We'll remind them that unless we stand together, the realm remains vulnerable, to remnants of the undead, to bandits, to the scars of winter. If reason prevails, they'll see the necessity of forging a new order." The next days blurred in a flurry of arrivals and tense receptions. Daenerys and Jon stood in the Red Keep's courtyard or in hastily prepared reception halls, greeting delegates who traveled from every corner of Westeros. Dorne's Lady Maria Martell arrived first, tall and fierce, her eyes still burning with the pain of losing so many of her kin. She eyed Daenerys with cool politeness, but her attention gravitated toward Jon. They spoke of the harsh toll Dorne had paid in the war, the uncertain future of trade routes, and the Dornish desire for independence. Daenerys assured her that all grievances would be heard. The Tarleys came next, a cousin of Randall Tarley, a thin-faced man named Richard, representing House Tarley now that its main line was effectively destroyed. He looked upon Daenerys with undisguised unease, referencing how she had once executed Randall and Dickon Tarley by dragonfire. Daenerys held his gaze, acknowledging the past but offering no apology for that moment of war. Still, she promised that House Tarley would have a voice in shaping the future. To her mild surprise, Richard seemed less vengeful than she feared, possibly because the Tarley fortunes depended on forging new alliances and stabilizing the Reach. Day by day, the flow continued. Minor lords from the Westerlands arrived in small groups, half expecting to find Cersei Lannister still on the throne. They expressed cautious relief that the city was not a smoldering ruin. The Iron Islands envoy, a salty old captain named Tor, claimed Lady Yara was still consolidating her rule at Pike, but pledged her support for a realm united against further threats. Daenerys noted the hidden pride in his weathered face. He believed the Ironborn should remain largely autonomous, but he recognized that the Seven Kingdoms were no longer truly separate states. The war had proven that an existential threat to one was a threat to all. 2 weeks passed in this manner, with delegates filling the Red Keep's corridors, each bringing their own demands, grievances, and hopes. Tensions simmered between old rivals, Dorne and the Reach, the Iron Islands and the North, the Vale and the Riverlands. Daenerys and Jon mediated where they could, reminding each faction of the greater danger that still lurked beyond. The meeting that promised to be the most significant, however, was with Sansa Stark, who was due to arrive shortly. Finally, on a crisp morning that felt more like deep autumn than approaching spring, horns sounded at the gates. A northern entourage, banners of the direwolf snapping in the breeze, approached King's Landing. Daenerys and Jon stood atop the Red Keep's ramparts, watching the procession wind through the city streets. The crowds parted, many curious to see the fabled Lady of Winterfell, others still uncertain if they should cheer for House Stark or fear them. Jon's expression was guarded. He had not seen Sansa since the end of the war in the north. Their last meeting had been overshadowed by the crisis at Winterfell, the urgent flight south. Now, Sansa arrived as a power in her own right, representing the northern lords who looked to her for guidance in these troubled times. The gates of the Red Keep swung open, and Sansa Stark rode in with regal poise. She wore furs suited to the north, a silver wolf's head pin clasping her cloak. Her auburn hair was braided in a crown-like fashion, her features composed. Beside her rode Lord Royce of the Vale and a handful of northern bannermen. As she dismounted, her gaze swept the courtyard, taking in the Targaryen banners, the gold cloaks, and the sight of Drogon perched on a massive stone outcrop beyond the keep's walls. Her posture stiffened at the dragon's presence. Daenerys descended the steps with Jon at her side. Sansa's eyes flickered to Daenerys first. A moment of silence stretched between them, weighted by shared history and unresolved questions. Then Sansa turned to Jon, dipping her head in a respectful, if not particularly warm greeting. "Jon, Sansa," he said quietly, stepping forward to embrace her. She returned the gesture after a beat of hesitation, her gaze traveling briefly to Daenerys. The tension was unmistakable. After the greeting, Daenerys inclined her head. "Lady Stark, we're grateful you came." Sansa studied her with clear, calculating eyes. "I came because the North must have a say in the fate of the realm. We lost more to the war than most can fathom." Her gaze dropped to Daenerys's hands, noticing the faint sheen of frost that seemed to cling to her skin. "And we have questions about the lingering effects of the Great War." Daenerys kept her composure, though she sensed Sansa's pointed reference to the White Walker magic. "I understand. We hope this great council can address those concerns and others." Sansa shifted her attention to Drogon's distant silhouette. "I never thought I would return to King's Landing after all that happened, but these are unprecedented times." She looked at Jon, a flicker of something akin to concern crossing her features. "Is your place here now, Jon? Have you abandoned the North to others?" Jon set his jaw. "I haven't abandoned the North. My duty is to the entire realm, Sansa. You know that." A delicate tension hung in the air, intangible but very real. Sansa pressed her lips together, then nodded. "We'll speak more in private. There's much to discuss." Thus began the formalities of receiving House Stark. Sansa's bannermen were quartered in the Red Keep's outer towers, while the Vale Lords accompanied Lord Royce to secure lodging in the city. Daenerys arranged for a private chamber so that she, Sansa, Jon, and Tyrion could meet without an audience. The conversation promised to be pivotal, shaping not only the North's stance but also the entire realm's stance on whether Daenerys or Jon, or someone else entirely, would claim ultimate authority. And underlying it all were the ominous rumors of leftover undead, twisted abominations, and a winter that refused to break. When they finally convened in that chamber, the tension was palpable. Tyrion stood near a window, Sansa sat at a small table, hands folded, and Jon and Daenerys stood side by side. Missandei remained outside, ensuring privacy. A single brazier burned, casting flickering shadows on the stones. Sansa wasted no time. "The Northern Lords are wary, Jon. They've seen our people decimated by the dead, and they remember how Daenerys Targaryen was influenced by the Night King. They fear what remains of that influence in her." She looked at Daenerys directly. "I don't say this to be cruel, but to be honest about where we stand." Daenerys inclined her head, her voice steady. "I understand. They have every right to be cautious. I have not hidden what happened to me, nor how I was freed from the Night King's control. But the threat is not only my lingering magic. The threat is what remains beyond, pockets of undead or twisted creatures. We need unity to face those threats." "And how do we achieve unity?" Sansa pressed. "By declaring you queen and everyone bowing once more to the Iron Throne?" The North sacrificed too much to simply kneel again. Jon spoke up, tone conciliatory. No one's asking you to kneel, Sansa. We want a council, a decision by all the great houses on how the realm should be governed. Daenerys supports it, I support it. This is not another conquest. Tyrion cleared his throat. Historically, the Seven Kingdoms have rarely known peace except under a single monarch. But times change. Perhaps we need a different arrangement. Some form of shared rule or a reimagined monarchy that acknowledges the autonomy of each region. Sansa's eyes flicked to Tyrion, recalling the complexities of their past relationship. A shared rule? That might be more acceptable to the Northern Lords, provided we are recognized as equals, not subordinates. Daenerys stepped forward, crossing her arms lightly. If it ensures the realm's survival and prosperity, I'm willing to discuss any structure that works. The war proved that each kingdom cannot stand alone, and we can't afford further infighting. The White Walkers nearly destroyed us because we were too divided, too concerned with old hatreds. A silence settled. Then Sansa's expression softened, just a fraction. You speak truly about the need for unity. The question is how to achieve it without erasing the identities and freedoms of those who sacrificed the most. The North will not return to blind loyalty. We want guarantees. Jon's gaze flicked to Daenerys, who nodded in agreement. We can draft terms that ensure the North retains a measure of self-governance. The same for the Iron Islands, Dorne, and other regions that desire more autonomy. But we must also be able to marshal forces swiftly against any future threat. Tyrion interjected. Perhaps a system akin to the Old Lord's Paramount, but with clearer rights for each region. A single monarch presides over matters of realm-wide concern, defense, trade, major disputes, while each region manages its own internal affairs. We formalize it so future rulers cannot simply ignore the arrangement. A great charter, if you will. Sansa's eyes flickered with cautious hope. And who would be that monarch? The question hung like a sword over the group. Daenerys and Jon exchanged a glance. Jon looked weary, reluctant. Daenerys looked pensive, wrestling with her own doubts. Tyrion cleared his throat again. That is precisely what this great council must decide. Whether it's Daenerys, Jon, or someone else entirely, the realm must come together in agreement. Sansa studied their faces. I see. And if the council chooses you, Daenerys, would you accept a form of monarchy that limits your power? One that requires you to respect the independence of each region. Daenerys straightened, recalling the younger, fiercer self who had proclaimed she would break the wheel. She realized with a pang that perhaps she had, in a way, broken it by nearly breaking the realm. Was she prepared to relinquish absolute authority if the alternative meant a more stable peace? She inhaled slowly. Yes, she answered, voice trembling only slightly. I would. The realm needs a different kind of leadership now. My father taught everyone what happens when a monarch claims absolute power without accountability. I have no wish to repeat that history. Sansa absorbed her words, measuring her sincerity. At length, she gave a small nod. Then, perhaps, the North can find common ground with you. Jon exhaled, shoulders sagging with relief. Tyrion let a hint of a smile curl his lips. A promising beginning, he murmured. We still have weeks of negotiations ahead, but a sliver of hope is better than none. They continued discussing specifics, how the North might handle its own defense, how taxes and tithes would be arranged, how the newly expanded City Watch in King's Landing would be financed. The conversation was surprisingly civil, though cautious. Sansa occasionally revealed her distrust, and Daenerys did not hide her regret over the war's toll. Yet they both shared a dogged commitment to preventing further catastrophe. When they parted, Sansa stood and bowed slightly to Daenerys, a gesture of tentative respect. Daenerys returned it. Jon walked Sansa out, giving her a chance to speak with him privately. Tyrion remained behind with Daenerys, rifling through a series of parchments. Once the door closed, he turned to her, eyes bright with curiosity. You've changed, Tyrion said softly, an edge of wonder in his voice. There was a time not long ago when you would have insisted upon the Iron Throne in your own right, no compromise. Now you speak of limiting your power. Daenerys's gaze dropped to her hands. Frost traced patterns on her knuckles, and she closed her fingers to hide it. I learned how power without restraint can bring ruin. The Night King showed me that, in the worst possible way. Tyrion nodded gravely, then patted her arm. You may just save the realm yet. That night, Daenerys found herself wandering the corridors of the Red Keep, lost in her own thoughts. Guards stood at intervals, saluting stiffly as she passed. She felt like a stranger in a house she had once dreamed of claiming as her own. Occasionally, she saw glimpses of rotted tapestries or shattered stained glass, relics of the Lannister reign, the Targaryen reign, the Baratheon reign before that. So many rulers, each leaving their mark or their scar. She paused at a narrow window, gazing out over the city. Lanterns glowed in the winding streets, illuminating the sprawl of rooftops. Beyond the walls, the refugee camps flickered like distant constellations. Even under the oppression of winter, King's Landing teemed with life. She caught her reflection in the window. Pale skin, hair still streaked with silver and white, eyes that held a lingering sadness. Once, she had been called the Mother of Dragons, the Breaker of Chains. Now, she felt like a vessel carrying ice in her veins, uncertain of her place in this world. A quiet voice spoke from behind her. Couldn't sleep. She turned to see Missandei, clad in a simple gown, hands folded before her. Daenerys managed a faint smile. No, I couldn't. Missandei approached gently. I remember a time when your mind was so full of conquest and liberation that you hardly slept then, too. But this is different, isn't it? Daenerys nodded, a lump forming in her throat. Yes, everything is different. Missandei's gaze was warm. You're different, but that doesn't mean you've lost who you are. You care deeply for these people, for the realm. That hasn't changed. Daenerys fought tears. What if the realm would be better off without me? What if I'm a reminder of an evil that nearly destroyed everything? Missandei hesitated, then placed a tentative hand on Daenerys's wrist, braving the chill. I believe the realm needs you now more than ever. You've known the darkest magic and survived it. You understand what's at stake, and you still have your dragons. People may fear them, but they also need them to feel secure. Your presence, your willingness to change, might be the key to forging a peace that lasts. Daenerys bowed her head, touched by her friend's unwavering loyalty. In that moment, she recalled the earliest days in Essos, when she had only a handful of followers but an unbreakable resolve to free the slaves of Astapor and Yunkai. She had changed the world once in ways large and small. Perhaps she could do it again, this time by forging a new order in Westeros, shaped not by fire and blood alone, but by caution, empathy, and the haunting memory of ice. She gazed once more at the city lights, her eyes lingering on the darkness beyond. Missandei's words offered comfort, but the doubts remained. She thought of the abominations, the twisted footprints, the lingering sense that winter's shadow had not fully withdrawn. She thought of the Great Council, soon to be assembled, with dozens of powerful lords looking for reasons to distrust her. So many challenges ahead. Yet as she stood there, she felt a flicker of warmth in her chest, a reminder that she had sparked fire earlier in the Rainwood. The knowledge that the flame was not entirely gone gave her the faintest glimmer of hope. She took a deep breath, letting the tension in her shoulders ease, and turned to Missandei with a small nod. "Thank you," she whispered, voice trembling with both relief and lingering fear. Missandei bowed her head. "Always, Your Grace. Rest if you can. Tomorrow will be busy." Indeed, the next day brought a swirl of activity. More arrivals, more negotiations, more delicate balancing of old grudges and new alliances. The Great Council was set to convene in a week's time. The throne room would be filled with representatives from all corners of Westeros, each ready to debate the future of the realm. In the meantime, Daenerys set about implementing small improvements wherever she could. She directed her Unsullied to patrol the refugee camps outside the city, protecting the vulnerable from bandits or unscrupulous merchants. She had the Red Keep stores of grain distributed more equitably, ensuring that the starving masses at least had bread. She, Jon, and Tyrion labored late into the night, drafting proposals to present at the council. A framework for a redefined monarchy, a plan to address the leftover undead menace, a method to unify resources for rebuilding. All the while, the chill in Daenerys' veins reminded her of the precarious balance she walked. She practiced summoning small flames in private, hoping to strengthen the ember of fire that still lived within. Sometimes she succeeded, sometimes she failed, and only ice answered her call. Each failure gnawed at her confidence, but she persisted, determined to harness or at least control this duality. Jon too wrestled with uncertainties. He had quietly told Daenerys that if the council chose him as king, he would accept out of duty, but only if it truly served the realm. If the delegates preferred Daenerys, he would support her wholeheartedly. If they chose another entirely, he would respect that as well, though a part of him wondered if that new ruler could unite Westeros better than the two who had fought the dead firsthand. Whatever happened, they had to ensure the realm did not fracture again. On the eve of the council's official opening, the last of the major delegates arrived. Gendry Baratheon rode in with a modest retinue, looking slightly ill at ease in his new role as Lord of Storm's End. He greeted Jon with a heartfelt clasp, remembering their time side by side in the war, and bowed respectfully to Daenerys. Though still young in terms of leadership, Gendry possessed an earnest determination to do right by his people. That same evening, a solemn rumor circulated. A band of soldiers returning from the Westerlands had encountered whites near the border of the Reach, though the details were sketchy. The men insisted they saw walking corpses that fled into the night. Daenerys felt a chill that had nothing to do with her curse. She shared the news with Jon and Tyrion, who looked equally disturbed. It was a reminder that the Great War's aftermath was not yet concluded. And so the morning dawned when the Great Council would convene in the throne room, a place steeped in Targaryen legacy and the echoes of more recent conflicts. Delegates arrived in solemn procession, some wearing the fineries of their houses, others clad in practical armor. The dais that held the Iron Throne stood at the far end, overshadowing the entire chamber. Yet, by mutual agreement, no one ascended it. They arranged rows of benches and chairs, turning the hall into a makeshift assembly. Daenerys, Jon, Sansa, Tyrion, Lady Maria Martell, Lord Richard Tarley, Gendry Baratheon, representatives of House Arryn, the Iron Islands envoy, and many others took their seats, filling the space with a subdued murmur of voices. A hush fell. Tyrion stood, acting as a sort of moderator. He cleared his throat. Lords and ladies, gathered knights, esteemed representatives of the realm, we come together at this great council to determine how Westeros shall be governed henceforth, and how we shall address the threats that linger after the Great War. We stand at a crossroads. May our decisions here shape a lasting peace and prevent the darkness from ever again consuming us. He gestured toward the dais, where Daenerys and Jon stood side by side. Daenerys Targaryen, queen by right of birth, breaker of chains, and Jon Snow, who once served as king in the north. Both have fought the dead and paid dear costs. But the realm is not theirs alone to command. Today, we shall debate, weigh, and decide, so that all might unite in a new era. Silence gripped the throne room. Daenerys felt her pulse hammering. She locked eyes momentarily with Sansa, then with Lady Martell, then with Gendry. A sense of gravity filled her. This was the moment. Whatever transpired would shape the fate of the Seven Kingdoms, and perhaps define her own redemption. She stepped forward, summoning every ounce of composure. The hush deepened as all eyes fell upon her. She inhaled, ignoring the cold flicker in her blood, and spoke with a clear, resonant voice. "My lords and ladies," she began, "I stand before you not as a conqueror, but as a survivor, like all of you. The war against the Night King took much from us. Together we overcame an ancient evil, yet we have been left with scars that run deep. We gather here to ensure those scars do not fester into new wounds." She allowed her gaze to sweep the assembly, recalling the vow she had made to rule differently if given the chance. "I was born across the sea, believing the Iron Throne was my birthright. I crossed oceans with my dragons, intending to claim it through fire and blood. But in my time here, I have learned that the realm needs more than another Targaryen ruler seated on that throne. It needs unity born of respect, not fear. It needs a ruler or rulers who serve the people, not themselves. A soft murmur rippled through the hall. She spotted small nods, but also skeptical frowns. She pressed on, gathering her courage. I have wielded power, fire, and even, to my shame, ice. I have seen how absolute power can corrupt, how it can twist the noblest intentions. If you choose me to sit the throne, I swear to share that power with the lords of each region, to bind myself by the laws and charters we create together, to uphold the rights of the North, of Dorne, of the Reach, and all others. No more forced subjugation, no more blind subservience. We stand together or not at all. She stepped back, letting her words settle. Her heart pounded, uncertain how they would be received. Then Jon took his turn, speaking of the North's sacrifices, of the loyalty he felt toward both his heritage and the realm as a whole. He echoed her stance, that if the council chose him, he would accept only under terms that ensured cooperation and safeguarded each region's autonomy. He emphasized the threat that still lingered, recounting rumors of stray whites. We cannot be naive enough to think one victory ended all darkness, he said. We must remain vigilant, united, and prepared. Others spoke in turn. Sansa stood, voice measured but resolute, advocating for northern independence or at least near independence. Lady Martell demanded that Dorne's customs and freedoms be respected, reminding the assembly that Dorne had once been a sovereign kingdom. Gendry Baratheon spoke of the Stormland struggles, urging that no region be left to fend for itself against raiders or undead. Lord Richard Tarley pressed for trade incentives to rebuild the Reach. The Iron Islands envoy insisted that Yara demanded the right to sail freely and manage her own affairs, so long as the Ironborn recognized the realm's broader defense pact. Each voice carried centuries of history, grudges, and pride. The debate stretched for hours, with Tyrion facilitating, occasionally clarifying points of law or precedent. Daenerys felt exhaustion creeping in, but she refused to show weakness. She occasionally sensed the cold in her veins stir, as if reacting to the tension. She took care not to let it manifest. Near midday, a recess was called, allowing the delegates to regroup, whisper in corners, and align their positions. Daenerys withdrew to a side chamber with Jon, Tyrion, and Missandei, reviewing what had been said. They're inching toward acceptance, Tyrion observed, looking more tired than usual. Sansa doesn't trust easily, but she didn't outright demand northern secession. Dorne wants recognition of sovereignty in all but name, but they're open to a confederation. The Reach only wants stability for its farmland. The Iron Islands can be placated with maritime freedoms. We might actually craft a workable compromise. Jon ran a hand through his hair. This could work, but only if no one attempts to seize power at the last minute. We must remain vigilant. Daenerys felt a slight trembling in her limbs. She looked down, noticing a faint shimmer of frost creeping along her wrist. She clenched her fist, forcing it back. I need some air, she said softly, excusing herself. Jon watched her with concern, but nodded. She slipped out into the corridor, which echoed with footsteps and murmurs as delegates milled about. Spotting an open window, she walked toward it, letting the chill breeze of the day brush her face. She stared over the sprawling city, reflecting on how precarious the moment was. The faint swirl of ice in her veins seemed to mock her, reminding her that even if the council accepted her, she carried a taint that might never fully disappear. A flicker of movement drew her attention to the courtyard below. She saw Missandei speaking with a messenger who looked distraught. The messenger gestured urgently toward Daenerys. Missandei's eyes widened. She signaled for Daenerys to come down at once. Concern knotted Daenerys's gut. She hurried to the courtyard, heart pounding. The messenger bowed low, sweat beading on his brow. Your Grace, a raven arrived from the Westerlands. A group of knights encountered whites, many whites, near one of the old gold mines. They were forced to retreat. They fear the undead may be gathering there. Daenerys felt a chill race through her blood. The timing could not be worse. If a new cluster of whites was forming in the Westerlands, it could undermine everything the council was trying to achieve. Fear would skyrocket, old grudges would intensify. She pressed her lips together. Have they sent for reinforcements? Yes, but the local lords can't muster enough men quickly. They beg the crown. He paused, then corrected himself. They beg for your dragons, or any help you can send, to burn out the infestation before it spreads. Daenerys let out a slow breath. She knew the symbolic weight of sending her dragons to quell a threat. It might reassure the lords or it might stoke old fears. Yet if whites were truly gathering in any significant numbers, ignoring the plea could be catastrophic. She glanced at Missandei, who looked equally troubled. Bring this news to Jon and Tyrion, Daenerys said. Tell them I'll meet them in the council chamber. We must address this immediately. As the messenger hurried away, Daenerys felt her heart pound. The Great Council was poised to decide the fate of the realm's governance. Now a threat emerged that demanded immediate action. Failure to address it would be unthinkable. But leaving the council to join a fight might unravel the fragile negotiations. She wondered, not for the first time, if the realm's challenges would ever relent. With grim resolve, she made her way back inside, ready to tell the lords and ladies that the war they thought finished had one last, deadly coda. She only prayed they would stand united this time, and that her lingering powers of ice would not betray her again.